Within the majority of video games, obstacles are often introduced to test a player's understanding of the various mechanics they have been exposed to. These obstacles come in all shapes and sizes, but within role-playing games, they almost always manifest as a boss. The most frequent type of boss relates to the story, used as a way for the player to benchmark their progress and add some narrative payoff. To complement, there are sometimes optional bosses that can be fought, and these often reward players for venturing off the beaten path. In the earlier days of the Final Fantasy franchise, these two types of bosses coexisted, and they were often on an equal footing in terms of difficulty. But following the release of Final Fantasy V, it became clear that the game had changed, as a third type of boss appeared, the Superboss. These bosses would be designed to provide a specific challenge that went far beyond what the core experience offered. But what's interesting is just how much the role and manifestation of these so-called superbosses has changed over time. It's why we're excited to explore this particular topic in our typical granular style. And this video will serve as just the first episode in a huge multi-part series that will explore, we hope, almost every single superboss to have been associated with the Final Fantasy franchise in chronological order. So with that in mind, we encourage you to sit back and relax as we explore the complete evolution of superbosses. By 1987, video game designers around the world were still playing around with various mechanical toolkits as they sought to create the optimum balance between challenge and fun. This would almost always see the core gameplay loop focused on progressive difficulty enhancements, meaning that to finish a game, players needed to overcome challenges of increasing difficulty. Irrespective of the genre, the majority of these challenges were mandatory. Platformers introduced more difficult stage designs and obstacles, shoot-'em-ups introduced more enemies and more projectiles to evade, and fighting games introduced souped-up enemies that were at the hands of devilish computer-controlled opponents. Because of these games being modelled on the arcade scene, there was often very little room for exploration. There was only one path to victory, and sometimes that path could be walked for a near infinite amount of time. But role-playing games were different. They offered the player choice, and this changed how designers approached the notion of challenge in this type of game. At various points throughout the story, bosses would be used to benchmark progression and ensure the player was at an appropriate skill level or strength level to overcome the next set of challenges. If not, they would need to try again. But unlike in other genres, where the scenario would require players to just get better, within role-playing games, failure could be overcome by enhancing characters through the process of grinding, something that would, in effect, make the game easier. Within the original Final Fantasy, grinding was facilitated by taking part in random encounters that could occur either on the world map or within dungeons. The difficulty of these random encounters was tailored to the specific location in which they occurred, so as to not pose too much of a challenge. They would also almost always be easier than the boss encounters players were trying to overcome. But almost was the crucial word here, as within the original Final Fantasy, one enemy, which could be fought via a random encounter, was developed as a nasty surprise, and its power was on par with the strongest mandatory boss in the game. After slogging through the Flying Fortress, the game's penultimate dungeon, players needed to cross a narrow bridge to square off against Tiamat, the strongest and final member of the Four Fiends. By making it this far, players must have felt quite comfortable that they would be able to deal with whatever random encounters were thrown their way. The only question was whether they'd be able to overcome the final challenge that awaited. This scenario was one that the majority of players faced. But for those that were unlucky, another scenario occurred, the appearance of Warmech within a random encounter. In the original Japanese Famicom version, there was a 1 in 64 chance of Warmech appearing should a random encounter occur on this small bridge. This probability was then upped to 3 in 64 for the North American release. But even though the probability was increased, the challenge remained the same. The power of Warmech was on par with Chaos, the game's final boss, and it far exceeded that of Tiamat. Facing off against this mechanical nightmare therefore served as a horrible reality check for unprepared players, and the most probable outcome was a swift game over. Its powerful nuclear ability would often provide this deliverance, But even Warmech's standard attacks could still deal considerable damage due to its high offensive stats. On the other side, Warmech also featured very high defensive stats, and was resistant to most elements. Despite the challenge, Warmech could be defeated, and although nothing was offered in terms of high-level weapons or equipment, 32,000 experience was up for grabs, a figure that was almost 6 times more than the experience granted for defeating Tiamat. But if you were able to defeat Warmech, the benefit of obtaining that much experience was moot. Luck could also play a big part in the encounter, as there was a small percentage chance that Warmech would flee. This would result in no rewards being granted, but living to fight another day could be seen as a reward in itself. The other intriguing element around Warmech was just how out of place it was in comparison to the rest of the game. Almost everything was grounded in high fantasy, with elves and dwarves and lots of traditional magic and castles. Yet Warmech was a hulking mechanical monstrosity, and it's implied, much like the Flying Fortress itself, that it was a relic of a long-lost civilization whose technology far surpassed the modern world. And if that's true, it would explain why the nature of the challenge posed did not align with everything else that could be experienced in the game. Final Fantasy II saw wholesale changes to almost every aspect of design, and amongst other things, this saw new approaches adopted for storytelling and character progression. One aspect that was retained, however, was the notion of a challenging random encounter. In the original Famicom version of the game, this manifested through an enemy called Tetsukyojin, which would later become known as the Iron Giant. It could appear as an uncomfortable surprise for players as they reached the game's conclusion, but here it was much closer to the game's conclusion, as Tetsukyojin could be encountered on floors 5F to 7F in the game's final dungeon, Pandemonium, whereas Warmech was found within the penultimate dungeon. As if to signify its connection as a spiritual successor to Warmech, in the original version of Final Fantasy II, Tetsukyojin could only be encountered as the 64th battle in the area. Tetsukyojin could also flee, however, it would no longer be based exclusively on chance. Instead, the decision was based on the player's current HP, with lower HP levels decreasing the chance of the enemy fleeing as it was more confident in its success. This meant there was a notion of adaptation, and it also created a sense of jeopardy, as to win, players would need to act like a wounded animal. But this would then be risky, as the strength of Tetsukyojin should not be underestimated. When including all random encounters and bosses, Tetsukyojin had the joint highest base attack and joint second base highest defense. It also had the strongest magic resistance and could deliver 12 physical attacks per turn, whereas the game's final boss, the Emperor, could only land 8 physical attacks per turn. These factors, when combined, made Tetsukyojin one of the strongest opponents in Final Fantasy II, but the challenge could be mitigated through a sensible strategy, and its weaknesses could be exploited. Final Fantasy III, IV, and Mystic Quest would go on to feature some tough encounters within the game's final dungeons, but there would be nothing similar to either Warmech or Tetsukyojin. Instead, mandatory bosses would be much stronger by comparison, and there will be no question as to each game's final boss being the true test of party setup and strategic acumen. Final Fantasy V also featured a difficult final encounter, which saw the player need to best X-Death and then Neo-X-Death in a mini-boss medley. But beyond that, it also introduced 2 optional encounters that were unlike anything ever seen before in the franchise. The first, Omega, was a hulking, mechanical monstrosity that could be found wandering around the interdimensional rift, and this represented a clear evolution. Warmech and Tetsukyojin were both chance random encounters. The player had limited say on whether to engage, and although their existence is well known now, back when the first 2 Final Fantasy games were released, they were an uncomfortable and shocking surprise that would only be experienced by a select few due to them having such low encounter rates. Omega differed by being given a physical representation on the map, as if to goad players. This, by default, elevated its status, and its placement, which was thankfully right after a save point, was designed to make traversing that particular area in the interdimensional rift quite uncomfortable. If players were not careful, Omega would be antagonized, and the majority of players would not survive this unfortunate event despite their assumed strength, given Omega appeared in the game's final dungeon. What made Omega so threatening was that its strength was far and above any of the mandatory or random encounters that could be experienced, And this was unlike the case of Warmech or Tetsukyojin, where they were considered contemporaries. As if to emphasize this, whereas the 4 parts of Neo Exdeath had an average level of 80, Omega was level 119. Each individual stat was also very high, including physical and magical evasion and physical and magical defense. This meant that even if attacks did land, their damage would be mitigated. Omega also had 55,530 health, one of the highest figures in the entire game. Should Omega be bested, 50,000 gil will be granted to the victor, but there was no experience awarded, nor was there any powerful equipment available via stealing or a post-battle drop. The only thing the player would acquire was the Omega badge, an in-game trophy that served as proof that the titanic foe had been defeated. Elsewhere in the interdimensional rift, another superboss called Shinryu laid in wait. Unlike Omega, Shinryu was not given a physical presence. Instead, it offered something unique for a superboss by protecting something of great worth by appearing as a monster in a box. This, in turn, served as a partial reference back to Warmech and Tetsukyojin, as there was still an element of surprise, with there being no way for the player to know Shinryu was laying in wait until they opened the chest. Whereas Omega was level 119, Shinryu was only level 97, and it had 30 less HP, but that didn't make it any less fearsome. This might was displayed with immediate effect, as Shinryu would cast Tidal Wave on its first turn, and it meant most players would be left staring at a game over screen without even being able to muster much of a fight. With the proper preparation, however, such as fitting out the party with coral rings so as to absorb the Tidal Wave ability, Shinryu would be much more manageable. However, due to its powerful spells, which included the likes of Roulette, a blue mage spell that could cause instant death, it could still pose a significant challenge. Upon defeating Shinryu, not only would the player acquire the Dragon Seal, an in-game trophy that served as proof of victory, but they would also acquire the Ragnarok Sword. Dragon's Whisker, a powerful whip, could also be stolen during the encounter itself, and this was an interesting element, as it was also possible to flee from the encounter against Shinryu, so the item could be repeatedly stolen. The two super bosses would have numerous mechanical similarities, such as them both using blue magic abilities, but perhaps the most intriguing element was that lore tied them together. Similar to Warmech, it's said that Omega was an ancient piece of technology that was associated with an advanced culture. Shinryu, on the other hand, was an ancient beast of great renown. They had both somehow become engaged in a battle, and this battle was at a constant stalemate. Due to the devastation they wrought on the land and the population, it was therefore necessary for them to be sealed inside the interdimensional rift, lest they destroy the entire world. Before we dive into exploring how the comprehensive blueprint provided by Omega and Shinryu was built upon within Final Fantasy VI and VII, did you know that we currently have over 300,000 subscribers, but that over 60% of the people who watch our videos are not subscribed? If you're not subscribed and you choose to do so right now, you can get us way closer to our next big milestone, hitting 350,000 subscribers. Due to the prominent and successful implementation of superbosses in Final Fantasy V, the original plan was to provide a similar experience in Final Fantasy VI. This was meant to manifest through the Kaiser dragon, but due to time constraints, the content ended up being dummied out. But even though the true superboss was cut, players were still able to square off against a pseudo-superboss. Deathgaze could be encountered in the World of Ruin, but initiating the encounter was not straightforward. Much like Omega, Deathgaze was given a physical representation on the world map, and the fight initiated when occupying the same space. But finding Deathgaze was part of the challenge, as it would hide in random locations and the player needed to hunt it down. Even though this was not a direct replica for any previous superboss, it did mean Deathgaze still retained the element of surprise, except now, instead of being a random encounter or a monster in a box, its location was based on probability calculations, and unwitting players could start the fight by accident or through sheer curiosity. Where Deathgaze also differed was its relative strength. Previous superbosses were either on even terms with some of the strongest mandatory bosses or would surpass them. Deathgaze did not fall into this category. It would still be one of the hard enemies that could be faced in Final Fantasy VI, but its strength was not on par with the likes of Kefka. Even still, Deathgaze could still pose a challenge due to its initial casting of level 5 death, use of strong elemental magic, and its use of Venom Claw, an enfeebling melee strike that was laced with poison. Deathgaze, much like Warmech and Tetsukyojin, also had the chance to flee, and this was where the challenge differed. As Deathgaze was a single entity as opposed to a random encounter, it had one central pool of HP, and when it fled fights and ran to a new random location on the world map, when the next fight was initiated, it would remain at the same level of HP it was after fleeing the previous encounter. The path to victory was therefore not about dealing huge amounts of burst damage. Instead, it was a war of attrition, as while the player could heal up between encounters, Deathgaze could not. After overcoming Deathgaze, no immediate reward was offered, but the party would learn that it was protecting the Bahamut Magicite, and this served to fulfill the same trait as Shinryu, which was protecting the Ragnarok. Final Fantasy VII, at least in the initial sense, would end up suffering through a similar scenario as Final Fantasy VI. The initial Japanese release did not feature any superbosses, but Ultimate Weapon did serve as a subtle allusion back to Deathgaze due to its random roaming of the skies and there being multiple encounters. Ultimate Weapon was then superseded as the strongest optional enemies for players to face, as for the international release of Final Fantasy VII, the developers took advantage of the localization time to make numerous gameplay tweaks, fix bugs, and add brand new content. And amongst all of this brand new content was two superbosses. Ruby Weapon and Emerald Weapon first appeared in the North American release of Final Fantasy VII, before then appearing in Final Fantasy VII International, which was released a month later in Japan. In spite of their delayed arrival, Ruby Weapon and Emerald Weapon had been foreshadowed, and in this regard, they were the first superbosses to have a direct connection with the in-game lore. This denoted them as ancient creatures of awesome power that had been created many years prior by the planet as a layer of protection should a dangerous enough threat appear. Similar to Ultimate Weapon and Diamond Weapon, both were given physical representations on the world map, and the encounters would initiate when occupying the same space. But whereas Ruby would be restricted to a desert around the Gold Saucer area, Emerald was free to roam around. This was again similar to Deathgaze, but the major difference was that Emerald's movements would be contained, as it would always move in the body of water between Costa del Sol and Junon. There was, however, a unique aspect to the spawning of Ruby. Every previous superboss or pseudo-superboss encounter, as well as Emerald Weapon, will be unlocked through natural story progression. But for Ruby Weapon to spawn, the player would first need to defeat Ultimate Weapon and then partake in a random encounter. Emerald Weapon will be available after obtaining the submarine, but there was also a unique element due to its location. Playing on the encounter taking place underwater, a time restriction will be imposed. Unless the underwater material was equipped, a 20-minute time limit will be enacted, and should Emerald Weapon not be defeated in that time, an instant game over would be the result. Similar to Omega and Shinryu, Ruby and Emerald would pose very different challenges, and one of the more unique aspects was that the fights had an adaptive nature. Ruby Weapon, for example, would see its tentacles appear as pseudo-companions, and its attack patterns would change depending on whether its tentacles were destroyed. If both were destroyed, it was also possible to flee the encounter, similar to Shinryu. Should the player use Knights of the Round against Ruby, it would counterattack by using Ultima, and this element would be shared between the superbosses, as Emerald Weapon would also be antagonized by the use of Knights of the Round. However, instead of using Ultima, it would counteract with Air Tamstorm. This move would then add a further layer of adaptation, as its damage was influenced by the amount of materia each character had equipped. Upon finishing each respective encounter, the player would be awarded with a significant amount of experience and AP, as well as a key item. Ruby Weapon would drop the Desert Rose, which could be exchanged for a gold chocobo, whereas Emerald Weapon would drop the Earth Harp, which could be exchanged for a collection of master materia. Helmed by Yasumi Matsuno and Hiroyuki Ito, Final Fantasy Tactics served as the perfect blend of numerous game design philosophies. On the surface was a gritty narrative and a compelling turn-based gameplay system, but for players that wanted more, there was plenty of optional content, including Midlight's Deep. This optional dungeon could be accessed after completing the battles in Malond, and it consisted of 10 independent levels of increasing difficulty. Everything would then culminate with a fight against a secret and ancient Lokavi known as Elidibus, who would act as the game's resident superboss. Compared with every previous superboss, this was a significant change. Outside of Ruby Weapon and the whims of probability, none had been gatekept. But to fight against Elidibus, players would not only need to overcome numerous challenging encounters, they would also need to solve small combat-based puzzles and explore, as the path forward was not always clear. After reaching the 10th floor, dubbed Terminus, players would then square off against Elidibus. But this would surface another distinction, as Elidibus had clear narrative exposition. With previous superbosses, the narrative had either been implied or there by association. But here, there were specific cutscenes created to add intrigue and raise the stakes. This was apparent as the encounter commenced, as Elidibus used the secret 13th Orocyte to transform into the Lucavi known as Serpentarius. This then continued the association with superbosses and ancient and mystical species or technology. Elidibus also wielded Zodiark, the most powerful summonable entity in the game, and due to the game's mechanics, any character who was using the summoner job during this encounter had the chance to learn Zodiark for themselves. To further add to the intrigue, a guest character called Byblos would join Ramza for this encounter, and based on the challenge offered by Elidibus, having this ally would be more than welcome. After the encounter then concluded, the player would gain access to numerous indirect rewards. Similar to Shinryu, after defeating Elidibus, the player could obtain 2 powerful swords, but beyond that, should Byblos survive the encounter, they would join the party on a permanent basis. Whereas Final Fantasy VI and VII did not feature proper superbosses within their original Japanese releases, the same approach was not taken for Final Fantasy VIII. Similar to Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VII International, Final Fantasy VIII featured 2 superbosses for players to test themselves against. But whereas in those 2 previous games the 2 sets of superbosses could be considered contemporaries to each other due to their relative power and the unique challenges each encounter posed, Final Fantasy VIII introduced a clear hierarchy of power. Each superboss served as an extension of the weapon concept that was introduced in Final Fantasy VI and then expanded upon in Final Fantasy VII. Ultima Weapon, which had appeared in both games, served as a tough mandatory boss in one and a pseudo superboss in the other, and in Final Fantasy VIII, it was the weaker of the 2 superbosses. Omega Weapon, which was a variant of weapon never seen before, would then serve as the true superboss. And although it's never been confirmed, it's nice to think that this name was chosen as an allusion to one of the original superbosses, Omega. Even though Ultima and Omega Weapon had different stature, they would adopt numerous superboss traits that had seen before, sometimes in isolation, but sometimes as a collective unit. Ultima Weapon, for example, could be found at the bottom of the Deep Sea Research Center, an optional dungeon, and this referenced Elidibus. Conversely, Omega Weapon could be found within Ultimecia's castle, the game's final dungeon, and this served as a reference back to Omega and Shinryu. Each superboss would also guard notable treasures of differing values. The 3 stars item would be rewarded for completing each separate encounter, but Eden, the most powerful guardian force, could be drawn from Ultima Weapon, something that served as an allusion back to Deathgaze, who was protecting Bahamut. And after defeating Omega Weapon, the player would receive the Proof of Omega, just like in Final Fantasy V. However, here it would no longer manifest as a key item. Instead, the Proof of Omega would appear in the tutorial section of the menu screen. There was also an element of intrigue associated with both Ultima and Omega Weapon. In the past, the majority of superbosses could be accessed with relative ease. Only Ruby Weapon and Elidibus varied here, but the methods of unlocking were still quite straightforward and required nothing more than defeating an enemy or navigating through a dungeon. Final Fantasy VIII upped the ante by providing specific challenges that needed to be overcome before the player was deemed worthy of squaring off against each superboss. In the case of Ultima Weapon, first the player would need to correctly answer Bahamut's riddles and then defeat Bahamut. After doing so, and then re-entering the dungeon, it was possible to go even deeper. But progress would be impeded by locked gates that would need to be opened with a resource called Steam Pressure Units. These would need to be carefully managed, as only 20 Steam Pressure Units were allocated to the player, and they needed 10 units remaining when reaching the dungeon's conclusion to trigger the fight against Ultima Weapon. To unlock Omega Weapon, the player would need to solve a very different puzzle. One party would need to head to the fountain and activate the switch point, and the other would need to navigate to the bottom of the staircase and ring the bell. This action would then cause a timer to appear, and the route to Omega Weapon would be unlocked. The player would then need to switch back to the original party and run into the chapel where they could see Omega Weapon lying in wait. The challenge posed by each encounter would vary in difficulty due to the aforementioned stature, with Omega Weapon serving as the much greater challenge. However, the difficulty could be mitigated by manipulating Final Fantasy VIII's leveling mechanic. Similar to many of the other enemies and bosses that could be encountered in Final Fantasy VIII, stats and usable abilities would scale along with the player. This meant Omega Weapon could have just over 100,000 HP and only 67 strength when faced at level 1, but over 1.1 million HP and 255 strength when faced at level 100. Neither boss would have its abilities altered based on level, however. And in the case of Omega Weapon, this meant it would always use level 5 Death, Ultima, and its most brutal ability, Terror Break, which would land 16 physical attacks on random targets. Final Fantasy IX was designed by Hiroyuki Ito and Hironobu Sakaguchi as both an effective and meaningful tribute to earlier Final Fantasy games, and as a progressive end to what had been a fantastic run of games on the PlayStation. It's perhaps for this reason that they were again only two major superbosses, and they would adopt numerous established traits. But these superbosses would also push established traits even further than before. Whereas every previous superboss was either a terrifying mechanical monstrosity or a powerful mythical being, Ozma was a giant floating sphere. Its colour palette was also quite abstract, as there was almost no consistency, and its upper half was light while the lower half was dark. This design has helped Ozma to become recognisable in an instant, but it has also become infamous as a superboss due to not just the challenge posed by the encounter itself, but also the numerous steps that would need to be undertaken to even gain access to the fight. Building upon what was established in Final Fantasy VIII, Ozma was connected with both the Chocobo Hot and Cold side quest and the Friendly Monsters side quest. In the initial sense, progress with the Chocobo Hot and Cold minigame would need to be made until access to the Chocobo's air garden was granted. This required the player to collect and dig up numerous chocographs, and then, based on the location shown, hunt down the hidden treasure. Once inside the air garden, players were then granted access to the secret Eidolon cave, and before entering, they would be given a stern warning by Mene about what lay in wait. This nugget of information, as well as a few other clues, alluded to Ozma being some form of powerful Eidolon that was associated with terror. This denoted it as an ancient and mystical power that predated the current timeline. The subsequent encounter had the potential to be quite brutal. Ozma would have 55,535 HP. Compared to more recent entries, this figure was quite low for a superboss, but it was in keeping with the dynamic ATB system designed by Ito, and it was also a subtle nod back to Final Fantasy V, as the figure was just 5 HP more than Omega and 35 HP more than Shinryu. Some previous superbosses had featured attack patterns that would adapt to actions taken by the party, but Ozma evolved this notion in a significant manner. Not only would this see its attack pattern changed depending on actions taken in the battle itself, but Ozma would also adapt based on general party setup. For example, if the party was set up to absorb or nullify elemental attacks or status effects, Ozma wouldn't waste any turns casting those spells. This then served to make the encounter even more difficult, as Ozma would be more focused and use its more powerful spells on a regular basis. One of those was level 5 Death, a spell that had now been associated with multiple superbosses. To further increase the challenge, Ozma could perform regular counters, and it also had the ability to operate outside of the established confines of the battle system. Ever since Final Fantasy IV, player characters and enemy characters would need to wait for their ATB bar to fill before they could take an action. The only slight exception to this was Final Fantasy VII, where the ATB bar filled almost instantly when a limit break was made available. This encounter featured a similar mechanic, as any action performed by Ozma would lead to it having an instant turn. This would then make it difficult for players to have more than one turn in a row before Ozma performed a move of its own. The fight could, however, be made easier, and although the method was nowhere near the same, this would resurface the trait just seen with Ultima and Omega Weapon. Throughout Gaia, friendly versions of monsters could be encountered. They each requested a type of jewel, and if gifted to them, the friendly monster would offer large amounts of AP and a physical prize. Should all 9 friendly monsters be found and the appropriate gifts provided, they assisted the player by weakening Ozma, and this manifested in 2 ways. First, they would remove the range restrictions associated with Ozma. This allowed physical attacks to land, making it easier to deal sustained damage. Second, They not only removed Ozma's ability to absorb the shadow element, but went much further by making it vulnerable to shadow instead. No matter which method was used, defeating Ozma served as a significant achievement, and the reward will be a pumice piece, which could be used to teach Garnet the game's most powerful Eidolon, Arc. This marked the 4th game in a row where the Superboss had an association with the respective game's most powerful summon, and the 5th game where there had been a general association with summons. This had started in Final Fantasy VI, where Deathgaze dropped the Bahamut materia, but the trait had been built upon with every subsequent entry. In Final Fantasy VII, both Ruby and Emerald Weapon performed specific counters in response to Knights of the Round being used. In Final Fantasy Tactics, Zodiac, the game's most powerful Eidolon, could be summoned by Elidibus. This in turn allowed summoners to learn Zodiac themselves. And in Final Fantasy VIII, Eden could be drawn from Ultima Weapon. And to further this intriguing trait, the association with summons and superbosses would also be present with another of Final Fantasy IX's superbosses, Hades. Access to Hades would be much simpler than Ozma, but there was still a degree of secrecy. Within Memoria, the game's penultimate dungeon, players needed to examine the area behind a large rock. Then, when asked to leave, they had to choose not to. This would seem simple enough, but unlike many other prompts found throughout the game, there was no on-screen indication that this area could be interacted with. After doing so, the encounter with Hades commenced, and almost as soon as it happened, a unique element would be seen. Whereas previous pairs of superbosses had a thematic or lore-based connection, here Hades had a direct connection with Ozma, and if Ozma had been defeated before fighting against Hades, a comment would even be made. After defeating Hades, players obtained the Wing Edge, the strongest throwing weapon available to Amaranth, but the real prize was access to Hades' synthesis shop. Unlike every previous superboss, the conclusion of the battle would not result in Hades being slain. Instead, Hades conceded defeat and offered his services as a sign of respect. As part of this, Hades committed to making something quite unique should 2 pumice pieces be brought forward, and that unique item was a pumice, thus making it so that if the player could not defeat Ozma, they would still be able to learn Arc. Final Fantasy IX also featured another powerful enemy that wasn't quite on the level of Ozma and Hades, but could still be considered a superboss, Quale. Being able to fight against Quale was not a straightforward affair, as the encounter only became available after catching 99 frogs as part of the frog catching minigame. Doing so saw Quale appear, ready to challenge Quina as one final test on the path to becoming the ultimate gourmand. The fight itself lacked some of the thematic elements of other superbosses, as there was no connection with summons, nor was there any notion of being able to flee or be ejected. But Quale had the joint highest HP of any enemy in the game, used status effects with brutal efficiency, and also packed a real punch via its rolling attack. The reward for beating Quale would then be the Gastro Fork, Quina's ultimate weapon. By this point in the franchise, it meant there had been significant evolution around the concept of superbosses. What had started off as a challenging random encounter grew to become a formalised part of the Final Fantasy experience, and ever since then, numerous traits began to emerge. It often saw the inclusion of not just one superboss, but 2, and that when 2 existed, they would have some kind of narrative or lore-based connection. Many of them also surfaced towards the game's conclusion, either in the penultimate or ultimate dungeon, or in an optional dungeon. And although rewards for defeating superbosses may not be direct, overcoming the challenge often offered powerful indirect rewards. An intriguing association would also be established between superbosses and each game's most powerful summon, Guardian Force or Eidolon, although how this association manifested differed from game to game. By the time Final Fantasy ventured onto the PlayStation 2, superbosses had become solidified as part of the expected challenge offered by the core experience. But even though that would be the case, Final Fantasy X ended up adopting a similar approach to Final Fantasy VII. When Final Fantasy X launched in Japan and North America, there were 3 enemies that could be considered superbosses, the first of which was Ultima Weapon. With many of the core creative team working on Final Fantasy X also having worked on Final Fantasy VII and VIII, Ultima Weapon served as a clear allusion to the past. And alongside its role as a weaker superboss being retained, its design was also similar. Omega Weapon then served as its bigger sibling, just like it did in Final Fantasy VIII. But there was a key distinction here, as within the Japanese and North American releases of Final Fantasy X, Omega Weapon only featured a moderate increase in HP. The challenge therefore came from how aggressive Omega Weapon was in comparison to Ultima Weapon, and abilities that were shared between the two, such as Shimmering Rain and Core Energy, dealt much more damage when delivered by Omega Weapon. It also had access to some abilities that Ultima Weapon did not, and two of them, Demi and Ultima, referenced Omega Weapon's previous ability set in Final Fantasy VIII. Nova then appeared as an ultimate ability, and it could deal heavy damage to all party members. Both of these encounters could be found within an optional dungeon called the Omega Ruins, and there was no prerequisite for facing each superboss outside of natural progression. There would, however, be some lore associated with the pair that denoted them as being ancient beings. A significant period of time passed between the first calm, which was brought about by Yunalesca's defeat of Sin, and the next. During this time, citizens started to become skeptical about the merits of Yevon's teachings, and one such individual, known as Omega, rebelled against the organization. When the rebellion failed, Omega was executed for treason. Due to dying an unclean death, Omega could not ascend to the far plane and became an unsent. But due to how much anger was held inside, Omega the Fiend grew in power, and such was the gravity of this power that Omega, who over time transformed into Omega Weapon, willed Ultima Weapon into existence. It was a sorry tale, but it helps to place these two superbosses into the lore of the world, and this was similar to the relationship the likes of Omega and Shinryu and Ozma had to their own respective worlds. The third superboss in this game was then called Nemesis. It would feature the exact same design as both Omega Weapon and Ultima Weapon, and it served as the true superboss in the original release of Final Fantasy X. Whereas the other two superbosses could be found within an optional dungeon, to square off against Nemesis, players needed to complete a quest. This quest was associated with an old man who ran the monster arena, and it involved first capturing 10 of every fiend in the game, and second, defeating all of the unique monsters that had been created as the quest progressed. Once these two prerequisites were completed, the old man created Nemesis, and it could then be challenged. Nemesis featured 10 times more HP than Omega Weapon and had maximum offensive stats. It would also use an upgraded variant of Nova called Armageddon, and this dealt 99,999 damage to all party members. And the intriguing note here is that Kimahri could learn Nova from both Omega Weapon and Nemesis, and this resurfaced an interesting trait, as although it was somewhat infrequent, blue magic spells could also be learnt from other superbosses, including Omega and Ruby Weapon. After the release of Final Fantasy X in Japan and North America, the development team started work on a re-release for the Japanese market that would also be used as the basis for its release in Europe and Australia. This new release, dubbed Final Fantasy X International in Japan, incorporated balancing adjustments and bug fixes made for the North American release, but it also added a whole host of additional content, including, but not limited to, the Expert Mode Sphere Grid and 9 brand new super bosses. Ultima and Omega Weapon were also enhanced, with the latter in particular being notable in this regard, as Omega Weapon was granted the same HP as Nemesis and the ability to absorb many major elements. 8 of the new super bosses fell into one category, and they were collectively known as the Dark Aeons. These fearsome super bosses were enhanced versions of the same Aeons that could be called forth by Yuna and many of the other summoners found throughout Spira. Each Dark Aeon could be found throughout the world, and they started to appear after the party escaped from Bevelle. Just like in Final Fantasy VII, this meant a story event served as the trigger, but they would not all appear at the same time, and they all exhibited different behaviours. Dark Valfor and Dark Shiva, for example, blocked entry to prominent locations, with the player needing to defeat them in order to regain access. The Dark Magus Sisters would relentlessly chase the party after they came within their proximity, and Dark Anima, which needed player input to spawn, remained passive until challenged. The other very intriguing element here was, of course, the connection with summons. From Final Fantasy VI through IX, almost every superboss had some kind of connection with the game's most powerful summon. In Final Fantasy X, the Dark Aeons served as the very embodiment of that trait. As they were the game's most powerful summons, the player just couldn't summon them. Via the Dark Mega Sisters, another trait resurfaced. In Final Fantasy VIII and IX, certain superbosses such as Omega Weapon and Ozma could be made easier. In the case of Omega Weapon, this was through manipulating the leveling system, and with Ozma, it was accomplished by completing a side quest. In Final Fantasy X International, the method was a bit more clandestine. Instead of being treated as one entity, the Dark Mega Sisters were treated as three. This in itself was a new trait, as there had never been a superboss encounter before that required the player to face multiple enemies at the same time. But that didn't have to be the case. As mentioned, when the Dark Mega Sisters were encountered, they gave chase, and the fight initiated if they succeeded in their chase. However, should the player run towards the valley and stay ahead of the sisters, they would begin to separate. Dark Cindy would be the first to give up the chase, meaning the player could split the fight into two separate encounters, one against Dark Sandy and Dark Mindy, and one against Dark Cindy. But it could also be split into three encounters, and this then gave the player a severe advantage. The loose parallel here was with Deathgaze from Final Fantasy VI, as the player would be able to heal up between encounters. Adopting this approach also prohibited the Dark Mega Sisters from using their devastating Delta attack. Should every Dark Aeon be defeated, a new superboss would then unlock called Penance. This method of unlocking was almost identical to the method of unlocking Nemesis, and as Penance was accessible via the world map, it also harkened back to Final Fantasy VI and VII. Penance served as by far the strongest boss in Final Fantasy X International, having 2 million more HP than Nemesis and higher defensive stats. Because of this, it would almost be a necessity to use the game's ultimate weapons, the Celestial Weapons, as they ignored defense. The next major challenge was simply surviving. Penance would be accompanied by 2 arms, similar to Ruby Weapon, who was accompanied by 2 tentacles. They would each take independent actions, and similar to the fight against Ruby Weapon, they could be rejuvenated, and their status influenced the abilities that Penance could then use. For example, Penance would only be able to use Judgment Day, its ultimate attack, should both of its arms be active. The left arm of Penance could also use Terra Graviton to deal numerous status effects, including Doom, a subtle nod back to previous superbosses who could also deal out death-inducing status effects. There were 2 major differences, however. Almost every prior superboss had a set script that determined actions taken. Some of these were reactive depending on the boss's current state, or if they were attacked by certain moves or abilities, but the core script remained consistent throughout. Penance differed in that there were 2 distinct phases. The other major difference came via Yojimbo. It wasn't common, but some superbosses in the past had an Achilles heel, so to speak, and the Iron Giant in Final Fantasy II springs to mind here. But Penance, for all its bravado and challenge, could be made into one of the easiest superbosses in the franchise, as it was not made immune to Yojimbo's Zanmato. Therefore, if enough money was delivered to Yojimbo, Penance could be defeated in an instant. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance featured 3 superbosses, and just like the original Final Fantasy Tactics, they were associated with side quests. After completing all 300 of the core missions, new side quests would unlock, and 3 of them, Immunity Pass, Favoritism, and Decision Time, would require the player to best 3 very tough foes who were known in-game as the Corrupt Judges. The first 2 missions would see the player square off against a single, very strong judge, who would be supported by a small group of allies. Each judge had an intriguing name, with the first named Judge Mike and the second named Judge Reinhold, perhaps as a reference to 2 very famous North American actors called Mike Judge and Judge Reinhold. These encounters were conceptually similar to Final Fantasy Tactics, as Elidibus was also supported by allies, but the parallel will be furthered by the party being supported by an ally for the quest line. In Tactics, this was Byblos, and in Tactics Advance, this was Judge Magister Cid. The third encounter was also against multiple foes, but this time it was 3 judges who were unnamed. Based on the number of opponents with similar power, this had shades of the encounter against the Dark Mega Sisters, but the difficulty would be much less extreme. Final Fantasy X-2 followed the same pattern, having 3 core superbosses. Each inherited traits from the past, but there was also room for some significant expansion. And in this regard, the best place to start is with Angra Mainyu. What separated Angra Mainyu out from prior superbosses was the way in which it could be encountered. After the Al Bhed started excavating the Cactuar nation, Angra Mainyu was woken from its long slumber, something that denoted it as an ancient being. At this point, Angra Mainyu could be encountered when doing random excavations. But even though the party could go on the offensive, it was not possible to defeat the superboss at this point. In most cases, Angra Mainyu would just eject the party from the battle using its unnatural selection ability, and this served as a loose nod back to Ruby Weapon, who could also remove single party members. The true encounter against Angra Mainyu would take place in Chapter 5. With the superboss being contained for so long, there was a fear that it would retaliate against the Cactuars who had imprisoned it. The Gullwings embarked on a quest to protect the Cactuars, but their success saw Angra Mainyu turn its attentions to the Al Bhed instead. This meant Angra Mainyu would have to be faced head-on, and it would be joined by 2 allies called Tarwich and Zarich. Amongst its array of abilities was one called Perdition's Flame. What made this ability quite brutal was that it attacked 10 times, and each attack would deal just under 20% of a character's HP. There was no direct connection, but it did serve a similar function to Terror Break, an ability used by Omega Weapon in Final Fantasy VIII that also struck the party more than 10 times for a hefty portion of damage. The other 2 superbosses could be found inside Final Fantasy X-2's optional dungeon called Via Infinito. Ever since Final Fantasy V, superbosses have been created that had some kind of connection. In that particular game, Omega and Shinryu were connected by lore, but superbosses in Final Fantasy VIII and X also had connections, and in the case of the latter example, one superboss even spawned the other. In Final Fantasy II, that trait resurfaced via Trema and Paragon. Both of these superbosses were unsent individuals, and they had an intimate relationship. Trema had served as the founder of New Yevon, and having remained unsent for so long, he had gained incredible power, even able to bend powerful fiends to his will. That then connected Trema with Paragon. Similar to Omega in Final Fantasy X, Paragon was created from the warped and twisted memory of an unsent individual. In this case, it was Lord Zion, who served as the original guardian to Lady Yunalesca. And it was perhaps because of this connection that Paragon used a similar model to Nemesis, which in turn was connected with Omega and Ultima Weapon. What made these fights unique though, and emphasized the connection, was that they were fought back to back. As soon as the encounter with Paragon had concluded, the player was forced to square off against Trema with no chance to even heal in between. Something like this had never happened before in relation to superbosses, and it added an extra strategic dimension, as players needed to manage their health throughout the Paragon fight so they didn't start off on the back foot against Trema. In terms of the encounters themselves, one of the more intriguing aspects was that Paragon used an ability called Final Impact. This would deliver 14 strikes against the party with a damage equal to 1/8 of their maximum HP and MP. And this was similar to both Perdition's Flame, a move used by Angra Mainyu, but also Omega Weapon's Terror Break in Final Fantasy VIII. When Final Fantasy XI launched in 2002, a lot of effort was placed around building solid foundations. And outside of core mechanics such as party dynamics, leveling and jobs, one of the most important mechanics was the introduction of what became known as notorious monsters. Unlike standard enemies found in the field, or those related to either main scenario or optional quests, notorious monsters were planned to be very tough and very rare. For this reason, the earliest iterations had high amounts of HP relative to regular bosses, and only spawned in the world once every 24 hours. The first notorious monsters were added to Final Fantasy XI during the beta on the 16th of January 2002, and they had affectionate names such as Slobbering Sue and Skewer Sam. But even though they were tough, and often had link shells competing for their spoils, none of these initial entrants, or indeed none of the notorious monsters associated with the initial launch of Final Fantasy XI, were often considered as superbosses. That definition would not be used until the launch of the game's first expansion, Rise of the Zilart, and the most accessible superbosses, known as the Archangels, were available through an optional branch of the main scenario quest. As the Rise of the Zilart questline reached its conclusion, players were required to make their way to Ruan Gardens. Here, they would need to square off against enemies known as the Archangels, who were dark manifestations of the player character races. In the traditional sense, each of these rather difficult enemies was meant to be faced one after another by a full party of 6, and they could be encountered in any order. But those who were up for the challenge could take on an alternate version of the quest called Divine Might. Instead of facing each boss back to back, this would see all 5 Archangels encountered at the exact same time, and this served as a much more extreme version of what could happen when facing the Dark Mega Sisters in Final Fantasy X International. What made this option so perilous was that each race adopted a classic job and sub-job combination, and they could take full advantage of the toolkits, including the use of what at the time were known as 2-hour abilities. And some of them, such as the Hume Archangel, could even use their 2-hour ability whenever they wanted. In the worst case scenario, this meant numerous Archangels could use their 2-hour abilities at the exact same time. And as some of them could even summon pets, this meant the fight could get rather complicated, as numerous enemies would need to be juggled. And to make matters worse, as this was an optional quest as opposed to a mission, deaths also resulted in experience loss. Everyone would therefore need to be well organised in order to manage the various scenarios that could occur, but the reward was worth it, not least because unlike the standard quest variant, Divine Might could be tackled by an alliance of 18 people. In the traditional quest, those 18 people would need to split off into 3 separate parties of 6, and each party would need to undertake 5 encounters. This then created a net total of 15 separate encounters. But by taking on Divine Might and pooling resources together, those 18 people could complete the quest with just 1 encounter. Another superboss called Kirin was added as part of a much larger patch that was launched on the 16th of December 2003. Kirin was classified as a notorious monster, and it could be found in the area affectionately known as Sky. But its relative strength was much higher than many of its peers. Players also had to undertake numerous steps before even having the chance to square off against Kirin, and this harkened back to some earlier superbosses. Perhaps the most notable part was that many other difficult bosses needed to be defeated as a precursor. Alongside Kirin, Byaku, Suzaku, Shinryu, and Genbu, and they were each classified as notorious monsters in their own right. Defeating them in their individual standalone encounters would grant a seal, and those seals would need to be traded at a forced spawn point in the Shrine of Ravitao at the same time for Kirin to appear. The fight itself had some intriguing traits. Final Fantasy X and X-2 had established connections between superbosses, with one entity having ownership or even control over another. Kirin took this notion further, as within 2 to 3 minutes of the encounter having been initiated, it would start to summon allies, and those allies would be the 4 notorious monsters that needed to be defeated in order to obtain the seals, albeit with slightly less health than their original forms. This meant, in the worst case scenario, players would end up fighting against Kirin and a combination of other notorious monsters all at the same time. And this then meant that back when Kirin was added to the game, a full alliance of 18 people and an ironclad strategy was necessary for success. Should that be the case, then players would have their pick of some rather valuable spoils, but they would also be granted the Kirin Captivator title. The final superboss worth talking about as part of this expansion was the Dynamis Lord. Dynamis was added to Final Fantasy XI in February 2004 as the first major piece of repeatable endgame content, and they proposed a whole new gameplay arc that revolved around players being taken to an alternate realm. The prize was the fabled relic weapons, which at the time were pretty incredible, but to gain access to even one would take a considerable team effort. In April of that year, Dynamis was then expanded with 2 new zones added, and the most important here was Dynamis Zarkabard, as the Dynamis Lord could be found within. As the premise of Dynamis was to create an alternate version of existing locations, the Dynamis Lord was a reimagining of the Shadow Lord, the main antagonist from the original main scenario quest who was based in Zarkabard. But outside of the visual style, there were limited similarities. The Dynamis Lord was accompanied by 2 dragons called Yin and Yang. They would be independent, but also have an intimate connection, perishing the moment players defeated the Dynamis Lord. And this was then similar to other previous superbosses, such as Angra Mainyu. Due to how and where the Dynamis Lord appeared, it was a serious step up in terms of challenge, but the rewards were worth it, as some of them were very rare items required in the relic weapon upgrading process. Much like Final Fantasy VII and X, Final Fantasy X-2 also received an international version, and amongst all of the gameplay tweaks and additional content was a brand new superboss called Almighty Shinra. Two of the major additions to Final Fantasy X-2 International were the Creature Creator and the Fiend Arena. Whereas one allowed for the recruiting of various enemies and NPCs into the player party, the other granted the opportunity for players to test themselves against challenging scenarios. As this developed, more and more intriguing enemies could be fought against and recruited, but from a lore perspective, the Creature Creator existed so that Shinra could learn more about fiends. This insatiable thirst for knowledge then impacted Shinra in an unexpected way. After exploring the histories of Ultima and Omega Weapon's Fireflies were absorbed by Shinra and he transformed into Almighty Shinra. From a lore perspective, nothing like this had ever happened before. Quite often, superbosses had roots in ancient history, and that was kind of the case here, but never before had a superboss been formed through the fusing of two separate entities, except perhaps Final Fantasy Tactics, where Elidibus called forth the power of Serpentarius. To fight against Almighty Shinra, a quite exhaustive list of requirements had to be met. The final step involved completing the Fiend's Tale for Omega Weapon, which resulted in the Fiend World Cup being transformed into the Almighty Shinra Cup. The fight itself was quite devilish, with Almighty Shinra able to use a handful of harsh abilities, and one of them, Final Impact, was inherited from Trema. But Almighty Shinra also had access to another ability called Cleone that had similar mechanics, also able to strike random characters many times. After completing the encounter, the party would then gain access to the Last Resort Garment Grid. Final Fantasy II International also featured another boss called Major Numerous. It too was connected with the Creature Creator, but there were additional factors at play. For one, a version of Major Numerous was fought at the conclusion of Last Mission, the expansion that came packed in with X-2 International. But this would serve as a mere tease for what awaited players should they wish to complete the Fiend Arena. After defeating Almighty Shinra, a new competition was unlocked called the Farplane Cup. This again fulfilled the requirement of one superboss being needed to be defeated before another could then be encountered. The Farplane Cup featured a combination of very tough foes including Seymour Guado, Orin, and Paragon. Major Numerous was then positioned as the toughest possible enemy players could face, but it only started appearing after winning the competition 3 times. And even then, due to the power of Trema, Major Numerous would sometimes lose that duel. If it won, however, players could be granted the chance to square off against this fearsome foe. And what made Major Numerous such a challenge was that it was composed of 4 sentient parts. This was similar to previous superbosses such as Ruby Weapon, but each of the parts had much more utility, and across them they had access to a plethora of high-powered abilities. Unum and Duo, for example, had a focus on buffs and debuffs, able to use Protect, Confusion, and Dispel. But there was also another interesting throwback to many earlier superbosses, as Unum could use White Wind, a variant of the quintessential blue magic spell. Tria and Quator then focused more on offensive spells, with Tria focusing on elementals and Quator using many ultimate versions. Each part would also have access to a unique command, which could deal high-tier damage, sometimes even ignoring defense. Major Numerous therefore stands as the ultimate test for those who are looking to challenge their knowledge of the Final Fantasy X-2 combat system. Even though the original Final Fantasy had an allusion to the superboss trope via Warmech, they did not become an official part of the Final Fantasy DNA until Final Fantasy V. But as Square started to explore re-releasing their older games onto more modern systems, the developers thought about how they could tease old players back. On the one hand, this was achieved by enhancing almost every aspect of presentation and making tweaks and modifications to existing gameplay mechanics and the story. But on the other hand, it was achieved by the creation of new content, such as items and equipment, and new challenges, which in the Dawn of Souls version came in the form of new dungeons and of course, the introduction of superbosses. 3 specific superbosses were created, and they each served as a humble allusion to where the notion of superbosses began. In the Lifespring Grotto, this saw Shinryu and Omega appear, and they both retained their Final Fantasy V sprites as well as their fundamental traits. It saw Shinryu again have high attack and low physical defense, with Omega featuring the opposite attributes, and they would each retain many of their famed abilities such as Tidal Wave and Wave Cannon. True to form, there would be much debate about which encounter posed the greater challenge, but one of them would need to be defeated in order to complete the Lifespring Grotto. Final Fantasy VI did not feature a true superboss, but Deathgaze did fill the void, and its appearance in this version of the original Final Fantasy, as well as its status as being weaker than both Shinryu and Omega, cements this notion. However, Deathgaze would still pose a challenge to unprepared parties due to its high attack rates and relentless use of instant death abilities. As Final Fantasy II was also included in the Dawn of Souls package, a similar approach was taken to building out the game and creating additional content. And in this regard, most of the focus was placed around the Soul of Rebirth questline. At its conclusion, players would square off against an alternate and more difficult version of the Emperor. But as this was a mandatory encounter, it does not fulfill the superboss criteria. There was, however, a challenging optional encounter that was included, and just like the superbosses that featured in the reworked Dawn of Souls version of the original Final Fantasy, it paid reference back to a previous superboss. Ultima weapon could be found in the secret chamber of the seal, where it guarded the Ultima tome, and it was notorious for having high HP, but also hitting like a truck through a variety of physical attacks, but also maximum level flare magic. Chains of Promathia launched as the second expansion of Final Fantasy XI in September of 2004, and they represented the next evolution of the game. It also represented an important milestone as it marked the release of Final Fantasy XI in Europe. It meant expectations were high, and with regard to challenge, the Chains of Promathia main scenario quest provided that in spades. But as the developers were looking to enhance the experience, they sought to create a devilish, high notorious monster that would put the rise of the Zilart incarnations to shame. This high notorious monster would then serve as Chain of Promathia's resident superboss, and it was called Absolute Virtue. Found within the Lumoria region, Absolute Virtue is one of 7 notorious monsters inserted into the game as part of a patch released in April 2005. The others were presented as jailers, each named after a respective virtue, and they were all interconnected, built to work towards a clear objective, creating the ultimate challenge for players of Final Fantasy XI. Similar to Kirin, jailers would need to be defeated in order to gain the item required to spawn Absolute Virtue. But there was now much more of a puzzle when compared to previous superbosses. For example, the 4th, 5th and 6th virtues had to be obtained from the Jailer of Justice, the Jailer of Hope and the Jailer of Prudence, and they would be needed to spawn the Jailer of Love. Only after the defeat of the Jailer of Love would Absolute Virtue then be faced. And this then created an intriguing parallel with Final Fantasy X-2, as the fight was sequential, and this mirrored the relationship between Paragon and Trema. Squaring off against Absolute Virtue was brutal at the time, and compared to every previous superboss in the history of the franchise, it ended up being quite unique in this regard. Superbosses had always been designed to be challenging, rewarding players for coming up with creative strategies to plot their demise. Absolute Virtue differed in that the developers were quite strict with regards to how they wanted Absolute Virtue to be defeated, and any victories that did not adhere to this strategy were deemed inappropriate and voided. This voiding came via Square Enix themselves, as patches were issued time and time again to render successful strategies ineffective. There was until 2011, some 6.5 years after Absolute Virtue had been added into the game, when the level cap was increased from 75 to 99, and the game became much easier due to an increase in relative strength for each individual party member. As of right now, it means Absolute Virtue is still challenging, but it's nowhere near the alpha superboss it was when it was first introduced all the way back in 2005. Final Fantasy IV followed the same trend as the Dawn of Souls releases of Final Fantasy I and II, as the developers sought to introduce new challenges for returning fans. But this time, the two superbosses they introduced were not mere homages to the past, and they could both be found inside the Lunar Ruins, a new dungeon that unlocked following the defeat of Zeromus. As part of this dungeon, each character would need to face a specific challenge, and at the end of each challenge was a tough boss encounter. This then mirrored Final Fantasy X International, as the tough boss encounter manifested through enhanced espers that had the Lunar moniker. But the true challenge of the Lunar Ruins was not these individual boss encounters. Instead, it came via the final trial, as players would need to defeat Zeromus EG. Similar to the Lunar Espers, and indeed the Dark Aeons, Zeromus EG represented an evolved form of Zeromus. But the main point of difference here was that whereas the other examples had similar sprites and models, Zeromus EG had a very different visual style. However, that wasn't the case for all players of Final Fantasy IV, as the default sprite for Zeromus was changed within the Easy Type version, and this was the version that was used for Zeromus EG. The fight itself would be challenging, but similar to Final Fantasy IX, where Ozma could be weakened by certain actions being taken, Zeromus EG could also be weakened. This was possible via the grimoires, items that were obtained after completing individual trials. If they were still accessible to the party when they fought against Zeromus EG, some of these grimoires could be used to turn the tide of the battle in pretty significant ways. For example, Grimoire LD, obtained by defeating the Lunar Dragon, would inflict the Toad status on the superboss. Even still, the fight would pose a challenge due to some harsh abilities. Big Bang, for example, returned and was now much stronger. And although this was expected, due to it being an iconic move of Zeromus, the odd association here was that Paragon from 10.2 also used Big Bang. The other superboss featured in the Lunar Ruins was a monstrous dragon called Brachioraidos. It could be found near the bottom of the ruins, and it posed a rather different challenge to Zeromus EG. Perhaps the most unique aspect was that the fight against Brachioraidos was quite dynamic, in that it would have distinct phases, adapting to the strategies deployed by the party. Each phase would have a preference for either physical or magical damage, with its final phase placing more emphasis on frustrating enfeebling magic, including Slow, Toad, Confuse, and Berserk. This emphasis on phases was then kind of similar to Penance. Upon defeating Brachioraidos, players would find themselves in possession of the Hero Shield, by far the best shield in the game, as it granted significant defensive boosts compared to the Crystal Shield. Dirge of Cerberus was the next game to feature a superboss, but even though it broke from convention by tackling a brand new genre of game, numerous traits were still present. Similar to Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, once the main story had been completed, extra missions would unlock. There were over 40 in total, and the final mission, dubbed Stronghold Impervious, represented the game's toughest test, not least because it concluded with an encounter against Chaos itself. From a design perspective, the setup here was then similar to Final Fantasy Tactics. Midnight Steep contained numerous optional levels of increasing difficulty, and the toughest test would appear in the form of a superboss housed within the final level. The major difference here, however, was that the superboss was thematically unlike anything seen before. Quite often there was an association with some kind of ancient species or long-lost technology, and the appearance of the superboss was therefore justified as the power upset the current status quo. Here, however, the antagonist was a mirror of the worst manifestation of Vincent Valentine himself, an unbridled version of Chaos. This did technically still fulfill the objective of being an ancient species, as Chaos was created long ago by the planet as a counterbalance and assistant to a mega weapon, but the manifestation fought against was based on Vincent himself. What then made the encounter all the more difficult was that the level, as an entire collective entity, was incredibly harsh. Regular enemies had beefed up strength, and the Sviets would need to be faced in unconventional settings throughout. These elements would then need to be navigated even before Chaos could be faced. Now, due to the nature of the game, the encounter could end up being quite short in comparison to typical turn-based superbosses, but even when facing Chaos with a maximum strength Vincent Valentine, the risks were still clear. That then brings us onto a related property, Before Crisis Final Fantasy VII. Even though this game launched in September 2004, it wouldn't be until May 2006, after the release of Dirge of Cerberus, that the game would gain its superboss, dubbed Jade Weapon. With the main story concluding a month prior, the final major update to the game included Weapon Mode, and this saw the player Turk travelling around the planet as they attempted to find Jade Weapon. This then mirrored the original Final Fantasy, where the two superbosses were also weapons, and they were added after the game's initial launch. It also meant the connection with ancient beings was retained. However, the intriguing point here is that according to the chronology of Final Fantasy VII, Jade Weapon was the first weapon to appear, as it was awakened before the others in response to the threat of Zirconade. To encounter Jade Weapon, players would need to embark on a quest that would see them hunt the mysterious being. This then created a loose parallel to Deathgaze in Final Fantasy VI, as players needed to hunt around the world for Jade Weapon, squaring off against it numerous times. But this time, it was a lot more explicit and far more laborious. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect was that the location of the encounter could change. Due to Before Crisis being a mobile game, the player's physical location in Japan would denote the in-game location that the fight would take place, with Tokyo, for example, being associated with Midgar, and Hokkaido being associated with Icicle Inn. This then highlighted how much the concept of superbosses had evolved, as even though only 5 years had passed between the release of Nemesis in Final Fantasy X and Jade Weapon in Before Crisis, the volume and uniqueness of superbosses had only continued to expand. In the initial sense, this saw a huge increase in the volume of superbosses, with Final Fantasy X taking this to extreme lengths. But with the advent of new genres, such as the MMO and the third-person shooter, developers were keen, wherever possible, to explore how they could make their superbosses more challenging and devilish than those that had come before. After being announced in 2001, the initial plan was for Final Fantasy XII to be released at some point during 2003. But with numerous issues happening behind the scenes that included, but were not limited to, Square merging with Enix, and Hironobu Sakaguchi, the executive producer, and Yasumi Matsuno, the director, also leaving the company, numerous delays were inevitable. Final Fantasy XII would end up releasing in Japan on the 16th of March 2006, 3 years after the initial planned shipment date. This was a huge shame for everyone who was anticipating the game. But the positive was that it afforded the development team much more time to create supplemental content. One of the major areas where this shone through was with hunts. Final Fantasy X had introduced the notion of hunts through the monster arena. After a certain volume of monsters had been captured, a unique variant would be created that posed a greater challenge, and this then worked all the way up to the creation of Nemesis, the strongest enemy in the original Japanese and North American release of the game. Final Fantasy XI then took this further through the creation of notorious monsters. These were tough variants of standard enemies, or indeed wholly original enemies, that spawned in the wild and were effectively hunted down by avid players and sometimes even full-on alliances. Final Fantasy XII then took these elements and formalized them into the game's narrative via the hunt system. The tutorial hunt would see the players tasked with tracking down and defeating an enemy called Rogue Tomato, an evolved form of the deadly Nightshade enemy type. This initial foray was not meant to pose any real obstacle, but as more and more hunts unlocked, so too did the associated challenge. And this then culminated with a final hunt dubbed Farewell to a Legend. Even though Yasumi Matsuno had left partway through the development of Final Fantasy XII, there was still a fondness amongst the developers who remained. Some had been with Matsuno since his days at Quest, where he worked on Tactics Ogre, while others had collaborated on games such as Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story. This hunt was their in-game way of paying tribute to Matsuno, as the creature being hunted, as well as its in-game lore, had application that paralleled real life. Yiazmat was considered to be the most powerful dragon ever created, designed to guard a sacred blade. But, despite there being a lot of reverence amongst Yiazmat's contemporaries, it was driven to madness and became a threat to its creator. This then led to Yiazmat killing the very deity that gave it life, and Mont Blanc posted the hunt petition as a way of seeking revenge, as with the deity destroyed, life had a lot less joy. This lore positioned Yiazmat as an ancient being, and due to its demise, it was, in some ways, quite similar to Ozma. Numerous superbosses have been created over the years with the purpose of defending something, with perhaps the most prominent examples being the weapons. Ozma, too, fell into this category, as it was once an eidolon associated with the Terran crystal, but after becoming corrupted, it posed a much greater threat. Yiazmat was also encounterable in a specific location, the Colosseum in the Ridorana Cataract, and similar to Ozma, the location was neither the game's penultimate or final dungeon, nor could the superboss be found wandering around the world map. The encounter itself would be nothing like that against Ozma though, or indeed any other superboss ever faced before in the franchise, except perhaps those from the earlier days of Final Fantasy XI. And that was because it revolved around a lengthy war of attrition. Yiazmat had 50 million HP, and with regular attacks unable to break the damage limit in the original version of Final Fantasy XII, this meant it took a considerable amount of time to deal enough damage to succeed. On top of this, Yiazmat also posed a considerable threat. It could deal mass damage and displayed an element of adaptability, and this too manifested in a similar manner to Ozma. For example, should the party attempt to create distance, Yiazmat would alter its strategy. Due to the reduced perceived threat, recovery would be prioritized, and this would be supplemented through use of defensive and offensive self-buffs. But Yiazmat would also adjust its offensive arsenal, and this then highlighted a loose connection with the first generation superbosses, which often featured instant death abilities, as Yiazmat would start using more instant death attacks. The other intriguing parallel with Ozma could use attack charge time 0 to work outside of the constraints that were applied to the player. Whereas Ozma could take actions without having a full ATB bar, attack charge time 0 meant Yiazmat could attack with no charge time applied. Further to these elements relating to adaptability, Yiazmat also adopted specific phases. Similar to some other superbosses such as Brachioraidos or Penance, this meant Yiazmat changed its strategy after its health dropped to certain levels. But despite all of Yiazmat's strengths, there were weaknesses, and one of them created a further association with Ozma, as it was weak to the dark element, Final Fantasy XII's equivalent of Shadow. By exploiting this weakness and establishing an ironclad gambit strategy, Yiazmat could be defeated with relative ease by players via automation. But that should not negate the challenge offered, as players could spend hours squaring off against Yiazmat and have one mistake prove costly. And to make matters worse, if they retreated for too long, Yiazmat would start to regenerate health. Now, due to how iconic Yiazmat has become, it's often easy to forget that Final Fantasy XII featured another superboss. And the intriguing element here is that it had a very loose connection with both Yiazmat and also one of the very first superbosses. Omega Mark XII could be encountered inside the Great Crystal, and despite its strength, it was not classified as a predetermined hunt. But that's where the connection with Yiazmat came in, as Omega Mark XII could only be encountered once the hunt to defeat Yiazmat had been accepted. This then mirrored many previous superbosses that were connected to one another through various means, such as Ultima Weapon and Ruby Weapon, or even Trema and Paragon. But due to Yiazmat not needing to be defeated for Omega Mark XII to appear, the relationship between the two superbosses was more akin to that witnessed between Hades and Ozma in Final Fantasy IX. There, the two superbosses were independent from one another, but there were lore and mechanical connections between the two, and that's what was seen here. In terms of the actual boss, it was designed to pay reference to both the original pseudo-superboss as well as one of the original true superbosses. This came through via its name, Omega Mark XII, as well as its designation as an ancient Warmech. But if this wasn't clear enough, its in-game lore description noted that Omega Mark XII had used rifts to travel between dimensions. The other curious connection here was that the developers brought back the ability to flee, but in Final Fantasy V, this trait was associated with Shinryu, not Omega. It would, however, drop the Omega badge upon being defeated, and as if to combine with Shinryu again, this piece of loot could actually be used to create the Dragon Crest, aka the Worm Hero Blade, one of the strongest swords in the game. In and around the merger between Square and Enix, The company sought to remake and remaster some of the older 8-bit and 16-bit games as a way of introducing them to newer generations and delivering nostalgia for those who played the original versions. But they didn't just stick to updating the graphics and visuals and making gameplay tweaks. It saw Final Fantasy I, II, and IV all given quite extensive treatment, and each had new superbosses introduced as a way of providing extra value for returning players. Final Fantasy III was also intended to receive the same treatment, but due to a myriad of issues behind the scenes, it kept getting postponed. In the end, as so much time had passed, it no longer felt appropriate to release a game that would have been akin to Final Fantasy III Advance. Instead, the decision was taken to produce something much broader in scope, a full 3D remake that would stay faithful to the original game but adapt it for the expectations of modern audiences. This meant significant changes were made to the narrative and core gameplay systems. Of course, it also meant that an original superboss was snuck into the mix, and just like in the Dawn of Souls releases of Final Fantasy I and II, it paid tribute to the past. The Iron Giant could be found within a purpose-built hidden dungeon called the Iron Giant's Cave, and this dungeon would only be available after an extensive quest had been completed relating to Mognet. When the Iron Giant appeared as a pseudo-superboss in the Famicom version of Final Fantasy II, it was notorious for its high defensive attributes and high damage output that saw it deliver the equivalent of 12 physical attacks per turn. The high defense was retained here, and an aspect of the physical damage was retained too, as the Iron Giant was able to perform 4 actions for every 1 turn. What made this even more devilish was that the Iron Giant only had 3 potential attacks. It could deliver a standard attack, use Swipe, which delivered double physical damage to every party member, or use Meteor, which would deal non-elemental magical damage. After its HP was reduced, it would then adjust its strategy to only using Swipe, and this meant the Iron Giant could deliver huge amounts of physical damage to the entire party every turn. Many would be unable to survive this assault, and it meant strict strategies would need to be employed to ensure success. Soon after the release of Final Fantasy III on the DS, the Advance series continued on the Game Boy Advance with Final Fantasy V. And for this particular iteration, the original 2 superbosses were supplemented by enhanced versions. Even though many superbosses had appeared throughout the franchise by this point, they had almost always been either unique or serving as a direct tribute to another previous superboss. Final Fantasy V Advance therefore served as an intriguing evolution of this concept, as the developers created brand new iterations of the 2 superbosses that already existed, and they could both be found within a new bonus dungeon called the Sealed Temple. These new iterations were dubbed Omega Mark II and Neo Shinryu, and although there were distinct similarities to their predecessors, both featured significant enhancements. Omega Mark II, for example, in addition to everything accessible to Omega, could now use barrier change to adjust its elemental weakness, with it absorbing all other elements. And Neo Shinryu, in addition to everything accessible to Shinryu, now had 2 distinct forms, and this determined its attributes and its vulnerabilities. These changes seemed quite small on paper, but they led to a significant increase in difficulty. However, even though the challenge was enhanced, Omega Mark II and Neo Shinryu only served as appetizers for the game's true superboss, Enuo. Depicted as an ancient being who existed thousands of years before the main events of Final Fantasy V, Enuo was once immortal before trading that gift for control of the Void. Enuo planned to use the Void to conquer worlds, but he was defeated by brave warriors who wielded the sealed weapons that could be found in the main game inside the sealed castle. And this was an interesting note. Amongst the pantheon of superbosses covered so far in this series, very few had suffered a previous defeat that led to it being sealed away. Outside of the likes of Angra Mainyu, the majority of superbosses were purpose-built creations that had never been overcome before. What makes this interesting is that this particular lore node often ended up being foreboding, as even though superbosses like Enuo had been defeated before, they had not been vanquished. In the case of Enuo, he was sealed inside a temple to prevent further harm, and after gaining access to the location themselves, the party could encounter Enuo inside the temple's farthest reaches. The encounter then proved to be one of the most challenging to date. One of the distinctions here was that similar to some other superbosses, such as Ruby Weapon and Penance, Enyo had multiple parts that could take actions. However, during the first phase of the fight, they could not be targeted. Enyo also had two separate forms. In the first, its main body of attacks would revolve around high-level elemental and non-elemental spells. But once its form had been defeated, the multiple parts would disappear and a new, even stronger form would appear. And this was here we'd see more of the hallmarks of the superboss. For example, Enyo would start using blue magic, with one of the most prominent being level 5 Death, and this had not been seen since it was last used by Ozma. Enyo could also be somewhat adaptive, able to deliver a variety of counters. Perhaps the most intriguing point around Enyo though came with its multiple forms, as outside of simply being able to use a different array of abilities, the second form benefited from having enhanced stats, and this meant its regular attacks dealt more damage, but that it could also take actions on a more frequent basis. Final Fantasy VI Advance was released not too long after, and it followed a similar approach to Final Fantasy V Advance. This meant that instead of adding a random superboss that had more of a connection to the wider franchise than the actual game itself, the original plan was resurfaced, and this meant the Kaiser Dragon returned. Similar to other remastered superbosses, the Kaiser Dragon can be found at the conclusion of a brand new dungeon called the Dragon's Den. But to gain access, players would first need to defeat the 8 legendary dragons. By now, these notions had become par for the course, as many superbosses were housed within bonus dungeons, and many had required the player to defeat a gluttony of weaker enemies. The notion of multi-phase or multi-form encounters had also started to become more commonplace. But the Kaiser Dragon upped the ante here by having 5 separate forms and multiple phases. Each form would have 65,500 HP, but after seeing that reduced or having too much time pass, the Kaiser Dragon would use Barrier Change, a move only just used by Omega Mark II in Final Fantasy V Advance. When this happened, the Kaiser Dragon would then reset its HP back up to 65,500 and a new attack phase would commence. Similar to Brachioraidos, there was no set order as to which phase would be used when the new form came into place, and the Kaiser Dragon actually had 9 individual attack patterns that could be used at any given phase. The only thing that was set was that after the 4th use of the Barrier Change ability, the Kaiser Dragon would then use its final attack pattern until its eventual demise. This then saw the return of a long dormant trait, the association between superbosses and summons, as after defeating the Kaiser Dragon, players would be granted access to the Diablos Magicite. But this wasn't the only trait to resurface, as there was a direct connection between the Kaiser Dragon and another superboss called Omega Weapon. Should the player return to the Kaiser's lair after the defeat of the Kaiser Dragon, they would find Omega Weapon in its place. And similar to Final Fantasy VIII and X, this iteration of Omega Weapon served as an upgraded version of Ultima Weapon from the core game. But despite appearing in place of the Kaiser Dragon, it was much less harsh in terms of the challenge posed. By the end of the Game Boy Advance era, numerous 8-bit and 16-bit games had been remade and remastered. Some of them had even been through numerous iterations, but although new content had almost always been added at each and every opportunity, there had only ever been one new wave of superbosses added per game. That was until the release of the 20th anniversary edition of the original Final Fantasy. Alongside the original suite of superbosses that were introduced with the Dawn of Souls edition, this saw the developers craft a devilish new superboss called Chronodia. And perhaps to emphasize the nature of Chronodia's arrival as part of the 20th anniversary celebration, it was quite unlike any superboss ever seen before. After making their way through a new bonus dungeon called the Labyrinth of Time, players would need to solve numerous puzzles, and their success would then change the conclusion of the dungeon, and this was where the uniqueness of Chronodia came to the fore. Every previous superboss had been preset and individual. Players could sometimes make small tweaks to alter the battle in some way, such as adjusting Ozma's elemental weakness, or there being a degree of randomness via individual abilities or specific attack patterns, such as was just seen with the Kaiser Dragon. This helped to make each attempt different from the last, especially with the Kaiser Dragon, as with there being 9 different potential attack patterns, encountering the same exact string of attack patterns throughout the encounter was uncommon. But ultimately, Ozma was still Ozma, and the Kaiser Dragon was still the Kaiser Dragon. Chronodia, however, was not always the same Chronodia. Due to the volume of puzzles and the amount of combinations that arose based on the completion status of those puzzles, players could square off against 8 different iterations of Chronodia, and each one was unique. The basic version of Chronodia, for example, would be fought against if the player failed to solve any of the puzzles. It featured 30,000 HP and appeared as a single entity that was capable of using some frustrating status effects, including Seal, which locked out a specific command, and used powerful physical attacks. As more puzzles were completed, more powerful iterations of Chronodia were unlocked and then faced at the end of the dungeon. But the power didn't just come from increased attributes and an expanded array of abilities. Each iteration of Chronodia would be bolstered by an ally, and the effect was somewhat cumulative. The first 4 iterations saw Chronodia supported by one of the 4 fiends from the core game, and each 4 fiend granted Chronodia access to a unique array of abilities associated to that 4 fiend. Lich, for example, offered access to Flare and Kill, an instant death move capable of killing anyone without resistance who happened to be under 300 HP, while Kraken granted access to Ink. The 6th and 7th iterations of Chronodia then saw support by 2 4 fiends at the same time, but it was the 8th iteration that represented the true challenge. Alongside having the highest HP and attributes across the board, Chronodia would have access to the moves of all the 4 fiends, as well as some of those associated with Chaos itself. It meant Chronodia served as the ultimate representation of a superboss, as not only did it draw on the power of the core game's strongest enemies, it also had 8 different variants that each needed to be defeated in order to complete the game's bestiary. As a pseudo-sequel to Final Fantasy XII, Revenant Wings served as an extension of the wider narrative. But as the developers were keen to take advantage of the capabilities of the Nintendo DS, they decided to make a drastic shift in genre. Instead of being a traditional role-playing game, this saw Revenant Wings transformed into a real-time strategy game. But the impressive aspect was that many of the core Final Fantasy XII mechanics, such as gambits and quickenings, were carried over. Something else that was carried over was the game's resident superboss, Yiazmat. But even though it was still a very strong enemy and retained instant kill capabilities, it was nowhere near as strong as the Final Fantasy XII incarnation. One intriguing aspect, however, was that Yiazmat could be found within a secret dungeon called Midlight's Deep, and this served as a fitting nod back to Final Fantasy Tactics, where that game's superboss, Elidibus, could also be encountered at the end of Midlight's Deep. Not long after the release of Final Fantasy XII, Square Enix also released the 3rd expansion for Final Fantasy XI. Unlike the 2 previous expansions, this represented the first time an expansion had launched simultaneously around the world, and it afforded the developers more opportunities to be creative. It saw a whole new region created, with new collaborative gameplay modes introduced such as Assault and Besieged. And of course, it meant that alongside 3 new jobs, there was plenty of room for new enemies. Some of these, such as Cerberus and Hydra, were very challenging, but underwhelmed compared to previous encounters, and that sentiment would remain until mid-2007, upon the expanded release of Einherjar. Similar to Dynamis, this would see a huge group of players tackle challenges of increasing difficulty, and the objective was to progress through the winged chambers to access the Valgrand, where Odin awaited. This had shades of many previous superbosses, where lesser encounters had to be overcome before facing the greater challenge, and Odin served as a fitting conclusion. Similar to previous Final Fantasy XI superbosses, the initial foray against Odin within Odin's chamber would see the dangerous foe summon numerous allies at intervals throughout the fight, and these came in the shape of foamers, or undead manifestations of the player races. Alongside this, Odin used numerous abilities, sometimes at specific health depletion milestones, while others would be dependent on the mode adopted after the use of Sangatal. And this made Odin quite similar to Brachioraidos from Final Fantasy IV Advance, which could change its playstyle throughout the encounter. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the fight, however, was the use of Zantetsuken. As expected, based on the previous utility of this ability, it was designed to deliver an instant KO to any players within range. This then revisited the association between superbosses and instant death, and when Odin first arrived within the game, it proved to be a real stumbling block to players due to its brutal efficiency. However, it wouldn't be long until, via some hints from the developers, the weakness of Zantetsuken was identified. Any players who were using the heal command would be immune to instant death, taking magical damage instead. For the 20th anniversary edition of Final Fantasy II, the developers adopted a similar approach to what was seen with the same milestone release of the original Final Fantasy. But instead of adding one superboss to supplement the existing roster, they added two, and together they pulled from numerous superbosses from the distant past and more recent memory. Both Phrygios and Eumion were found within a new bonus dungeon called the Arcane Labyrinth, and they were connected in much the same way as the likes of Trema and Paragon. After making their way through the labyrinth, players would be greeted by Eumion at the High Altar, and he would summon forth Phrygios to test their strength. Should they succeed, then Eumion would ask what they sought, and this was how the game's ultimate weapons were procured. This then saw reference paid to Chronodia, as Phrygios had 7 different incarnations, and which one the player fought against was determined by how many key terms the party knew. If, for example, the party knew 4 or less key terms, the weakest version of Phrygios would be encountered. This version only had 800 HP, minimal offensive and defensive attributes, and could only perform standard attacks that were laced with venom. However, should the party work their way up to knowing all 15 key terms, they would face a very different version of Phrygios. Would have 15,000 HP and defensive attributes that were 4 times as strong. But it also now had standard attacks that could cause instant death and access to some of the most powerful elemental spells and Starfall 16, which was only previously used by the Light Emperor in the Dawn of Souls iteration. Now, should the party defeat Phrygios and then say they sought destruction, Eumion would then step forward. As the master of Phrygios, Eumion had access to an expanded array of spells, but lacked the attributes to deal strong physical damage. As such, there was an Achilles heel, its MP pool. Should this be drained, Eumion's offensive potency would be reduced, and the encounter could be made much less intimidating. Final Fantasy XII became quite notorious within superboss circles due to the inclusion of Yiazmat. It challenged players in ways that were unorthodox, and it led to countless war stories being shared amongst communities. But even though Final Fantasy XII was a critical success, Hiroyuki Ito was not happy with how people chose to play the game. The license board and gambit system were designed to remove barriers. Ito felt previous systems had been too restrictive and wanted to open doors for creative thinking. But once Final Fantasy XII was released into the wild, he noticed that the opposite happened. Instead of developing each character to fill either a set or hybrid role in the party, players just developed every character as a carbon copy of one another. They also found optimal gambit system setups that could adapt to almost any scenario. In response, Ito vowed to make the enhanced version of Final Fantasy XII, dubbed Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac Job System, much more restrictive. Specific jobs were now introduced, and Ito even went so far as to prevent players from being able to change jobs, as he wanted the game to help people learn to start accepting the decisions they'd taken in their lives. But for those who still wanted to find optimal ways of succeeding, Ito and his team developed something a little extra called Trial Mode. Trial Mode was composed of 100 different stages that became progressively more difficult, and the game's original 2 superbosses, Yiazmat and Omega Mark 12, appeared on stages 98 and 99. That then left stage 100 open to feature a brand new superboss, and it came in the form of the Judge Magisters. Similar to the Archangels from Final Fantasy XI, this fight challenged players by having them square off against not just one high-powered Judge Magister, but all 5 at the same time. Even Judge Drace and Judge Zargabath, who were not fought against during the main game. With a combined HP pool of over 1 million and the ability to act with complete autonomy from each other, this presented quite the challenge, especially because unlike the Archangels, where they were faced by a huge alliance, here the Judge Magisters needed to be faced by a selected party of just 3 members, and having just scraped through against Yiazmat and Omega Mark 12, which then brought back the notion of superbosses that were fought back to back with no break in between. Needless to say though, this upped the ante compared to those previous superboss gauntlets such as Paragon and Trema, and to succeed, players would need to have a very strong strategy in place. Crisis Core arrived almost 2 years after Dirge of Cerberus, but instead of being a sequel to Final Fantasy VII, it served as a prequel. As such, players took control of Zack Fair as they sought to understand more about his uplifting and heartbreaking story. As one of the strongest members of Soldier, Zack Fair was a combat specialist, and to ensure players had their own skills tested, the developers created a superboss called Minerva. In previous Final Fantasy VII properties, superbosses were ancient beings created by the planet in order to fulfill some kind of role. Sometimes, such as in the case of Ruby and Emerald Weapon, this was to negate a threat, but in the case of Chaos, it was to ensure the long-term survival of the planet on the basis that the threat had probably won. Minerva was also connected to the planet, but instead of being created for some kind of task, it's implied that she represented the planet's consciousness, and as such, served as some kind of supernatural being that was of far greater strength and importance than the likes of Weapon. After a brief cameo in the story, Minerva could then be challenged via the game's mission structure. Similar to previous games such as Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, as players progressed through enough missions, then they would start to unlock even more challenging ones. And the most challenging was mission 966, dubbed the Reigning Deity. Minerva stood as by far the strongest enemy in the game, featuring 10 million HP, 999,999 MP, and maximum attributes across the board. And these attributes could be channeled through horrible abilities such as Ultima and Judgment Arrow, which could remove MP, AP, and Zack's buffs. Much of this was par for the course though in terms of challenging players within the established framework, but what made Minerva quite special against her superboss peers was the notion of difficulty. Chronodia and Freakios featured multiple iterations that differed in strength. To modify that strength, players would need to solve the puzzles that stood before them, but the expectation was that the challenge could be overcome based on that game's meta. Where Minerva differed was that a purpose-built upgrade was created that could only be accessible when playing on hard mode through a second playthrough, and to increase the challenge, Minerva was given double the maximum HP. Wings of the Goddess arrived as the fourth expansion for Final Fantasy XI towards the end of 2007, and it brought with it an array of new jobs, new missions, and of course, new enemies. But even though that was the case, content was still being added to the previous expansion, Treasures of Artugan, and in June of 2008, this saw the introduction of the Zeni Notorious Monster system. This was reminiscent of the Monster Arena from Final Fantasy X, but it was also similar to the progressive spawning system that led up to the encounter against Absolute Virtue. This system though revolved around Zeni, a new type of currency that could be used to purchase items that could spawn a new suite of notorious monsters. But it was not possible to go straight to the highest tier of notorious monster. Similar to those aforementioned systems, players would first need to beat a tier 1 monster before being able to purchase a tier 2 spawn item. The system featured 5 tiers in total, and sitting at the top of the tree was a superboss that has now become infamous, Pandemonium Warden. The encounter against Pandemonium Warden was brutal. It would appear in one form before shifting to take on the form of other Artugan notorious monsters such as Cerberus and Medusa. It would continue to cycle through many forms until settling back to its original form, but all of them would need to be defeated in order to achieve victory. This meant that unlike previous superbosses, where they may have many forms that were thematic, here players would need to be familiar with how to fight against countless other pseudo-superbosses, as they would need to square off against each of them in what was essentially a massive gauntlet. Such was the brutality of the encounter, that Final Fantasy XI started getting the wrong kind of mainstream media coverage. In response, the developers implemented a change that meant the Jade of Love, Absolute Virtue, and Pandemonium Warden would despawn if not defeated within 2 hours. Each of these superbosses also had their attributes and abilities tweaked, but it wouldn't be until almost 5 months later that Pandemonium Warden was first slain. Following the success of the Final Fantasy III Remake, Square Enix were quick to greenlight a similar approach being applied to Final Fantasy IV. And alongside new visuals, an expanded narrative, voice acting, and a spruced up combat system, 2 new superbosses were introduced into the mix. The intriguing element here, however, was that neither superboss could be fought during an initial playthrough. Instead, players would need to make use of the New Game Plus feature, and it was only during a subsequent playthrough that the superbosses would be accessible. However, even with this added barrier, there were still more hoops for the player to jump through. Final Fantasy XI introduced the notion of specific items being used to call forth powerful enemies, and the exact same approach was required to square off against Proto-Babil. When fighting against Zeromus at the end of the game, players would need to make sure they stole the Dark Matter. This item could then be carried through into a new playthrough via New Game Plus, and if it was exchanged with the face on the moon's surface, the fight against Proto-Babil would be initiated. With incredibly high attributes and over 400,000 HP, Proto-Babil represented a real challenge when compared to Zeromus. And this was further emphasized by an ability called the Light of Babel, which could deal up to 9,999 damage unless strong enough armor was equipped and a defensive posture was adopted. Proto-Babil also made use of a recurring trait associated with superbosses, as it could cause instant death via its 9th dimension ability. And there were also numerous opportunities for it to counter with powerful abilities such as Object 199, which ignored defense to generally deal 9,999 damage. After enough damage had been dealt to Proto-Babil though, it would change its stance, and could then use Divine Judgment to deal incredible damage to the entire party. The other superboss, known as Geryon, did not require the party to steal and then use an item to encounter it, but it would only appear after the defeat of the 4 Archfiends. And this was because Geryon was connected with the Archfiends and could use all of their signature attacks throughout the encounter. Due to Geryon's enhanced attributes, each of these abilities had the potential to deal a considerable increase in damage, but the challenge posed was not on par with Proto-Babil. That's not to say there weren't some intriguing aspects though, with perhaps the most interesting being that Geryon featured an adaptive routine, and this would come to the fore should the party be defeated, with Kain then instructed to jump. If this scenario occurred, Geryon would take advantage of the lull and self-cast Inferno, as due to its elemental affinities, it acted as a powerful curative spell. Some years after the release of the Final Fantasy IV Remake, the same team produced a sequel called Final Fantasy IV The After Years. This featured 2 enemies that could be classified as superbosses, but instead of paying reference to any of the previous iterations of Final Fantasy IV, they pay reference to Final Fantasy V. Both Omega and the Nova Dragon, which served as a clear allusion to Shinryu, could be found inside the True Moon, the game's final dungeon. This, in itself, was a reference back to Final Fantasy V, as there, both Omega and Shinryu could be fought inside the Interdimensional Rift, that game's final dungeon. Each encounter was then reminiscent, with Nova Dragon having more HP but lower defensive attributes, and Omega having strong elemental affinities while still being weak to lightning. Their movesets were also similar, albeit expanded, with Omega using Wave Cannon, now called Surge Cannon, and the Nova Dragon using Tsunami to great effect. There were a few new elements added though, outside of new abilities, and one of them was an adaptive move from Omega. If the player used a Blue Fang, an item that dealt lightning damage, Omega would retaliate with Meltdown, an attack that dealt damage that was equal to Omega's current HP. Final Fantasy Tactics A2 was similar to its predecessor in that its hardest optional encounters were challenging, but not that challenging. It therefore means that while there were quite a few candidates for being pseudo-superbosses due to their relative strength, such as the Sankular clan and those found within Bright Moon Tor, a bonus dungeon. However, perhaps the most interesting candidates have to be the Upsilon. Within the context of the game, There was a canonical narrative link between the Upsilon and Omega Mark XII from Final Fantasy XII. Scientists were attempting to recreate this mechanical monstrosity, and Upsilon A1 and Upsilon A2 were the result. The interesting adaptation, however, was that the notion of Omega was merged with that of Omega Weapon. Omega had often appeared as a standalone mechanical entity, but Omega Weapon often appeared as a biological lifeform that was connected with a weaker variant called Ultima Weapon. That variant relationship returned here, as Upsilon A1 was the weaker variant of Upsilon A2, and the latter was given a specific name dubbed Magic Weapon. Similar to the original Tactics Advance, the encounter against Magic Weapon came via an optional side quest, but here it could only be accessed after finishing the final story quest and achieving rank 90 or above. Alongside its high HP and incredible stats, what made Magic Weapon a devilish encounter wasn't so much its abilities, but its range. Similar to other superbosses of the past, this meant Magic Weapon was seemingly able to operate outside of the confines of the established combat system, as it could attack the party from the other side of the map without any real fear of retribution. Players therefore needed to close the gap to stand any chance, which was easier said than done. This particular aspect then highlighted how much the concept of superbosses continued to evolve. Similar traits would recur with more frequency, but how they were implemented changed from game to game, and as more and more spin-offs were introduced, it allowed more novel interpretations to creep in. Perhaps the biggest innovation during this period, however, was the solidification of the multi-phase, multi-form, and multivariant superbosses. Whereas previous superbosses had started to introduce phases, which would see the behaviour of the superboss change as the encounter progressed, Final Fantasy VI Advance saw the Kaiser Dragon feature a plethora of different forms, with each form adopting a phase that was picked at random. The anniversary editions of Final Fantasy I and II then evolved this notion, as instead of featuring a single superboss that had multiple forms, they featured a superboss that had multiple separate forms, and they could each be fought against independently as opposed to one after another. One of the core design tenets of Final Fantasy was that each game should be independent from one another. An ethos would still persist through naming conventions and the appearance of certain mythological creatures and core gameplay mechanics where necessary, but almost everything else, including the lore and playable cast, was expected to be original each and every time, as a way of challenging the staff and encouraging them to reach greater heights. By the time Square had merged with Enix, this philosophy had led to the creation of 11 incredible original worlds that were associated with the main number games, and even more when including powerful spin-offs such as Tactics and Crystal Chronicles. They each feature their own cast of characters with compelling heroes and villains. But even though there had been numerous games that saw these worlds collide, such as Tactics, Itadaki Street, and Kingdom Hearts, there had never been a game created that saw protagonists and antagonists from every mainline game connected via a shared mythology. And outside of Erguise, there had never been the notion of seeing how these characters handled in a live-action fighting environment. This all changed with the launch of Dissidia Final Fantasy. Developed as a unique fighting game that would serve as both an extension of the original Final Fantasy and as its own original canonical universe, Dissidia found a way to have the main protagonists and antagonists of the main numbered games come together. And at the heart of it all was Chaos, the antagonist from the original Final Fantasy. After the main campaign was then completed and Chaos had been vanquished, the Dual Colosseum unlocked. And it was here that the game's superboss could be faced, which was also Chaos. The Dual Colosseum served as an optional gameplay mode, not too dissimilar to Trial Mode in Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac Job System. The major difference, though, was that unlike Trial Mode, where everything was crafted to end with a crescendo against the Judge Magisters, Dual Colosseum was random. There were 5 different courses available, each pitting the player against enemies of differing strengths, and the final course, dubbed Blackjack, saw the player square off against enemies ranging between level 100 and 150. But this was not made available until the completion of an additional storyline campaign called Inward Chaos. It was only after Inward Chaos was cleared that Blackjack could be tackled, and within this course it was possible to fight Chaos at level 150, a significant upgrade on the version of Chaos encountered during the story. This then introduced an interesting twist, as the game's representation of a superboss was an enhanced version of the game's final boss. Further to this, due to the nature of the Colosseum, level 150 Chaos could be faced an indefinite number of times, making it more in line with what might be expected from a pseudo-superboss. After working on the Final Fantasy IV Remake, instead of then proceeding to work on a Final Fantasy V Remake, the team decided to create Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light. It served as a modern adaptation of the classic 8-bit and 16-bit era Final Fantasy games, and this meant alongside there being 4 Heroes of Light, there was also a comprehensive job system, and of course, superbosses. But the superbosses housed within the final product were nowhere near as impactful as the likes of the Iron Giant, Proto-Babil, or Geryon. The game featured 6 superbosses in total, and they could be found at the top of 4 separate bonus locations. 2 of these locations featured individual superboss encounters, while 2 featured encounters against 2 superbosses at the same time. In theory, this was an intriguing notion, as there had never before been multiple instances of multi-boss encounters within the same game outside of Final Fantasy XI. However, in each instance, even those where 2 superbosses were encountered at the same time, the fights were weaker than the game's final boss, and this therefore made them more akin to pseudo-superbosses, as the strength of Warmech, for example, was weaker than Chaos in the original Final Fantasy. With so much time having passed between the release of Final Fantasy X-2 and Final Fantasy XIII, even though core members of the team persisted between both projects, they ended up featuring fundamental scope and design differences. One thing that did remain, however, was the notion of superbosses. The most notable came via the Seath Stones. Not dissimilar to the hunt system in Final Fantasy XII, Seath Stones could be found littered throughout Grand Pulse, and they housed challenging encounters of increasing difficulty known as marks. The final Seath Stone, which could be accessed after defeating marks 27 through 51, then contained the most devilish mark, known as Vercingetorix. Much like many prominent superbosses from the franchise's past, Vercingetorix had in-game lore rooted in history. It was revealed to be one of the Undying, an ancient group of fearsome Seath who refused to surrender when their focus was left unfulfilled. This then had parallels to the likes of Omega and Paragon in Final Fantasy X and X-2 respectively, as their rage allowed them to live on. Amongst this group, Vercingetorix was known to be the strongest, and that designation held true within the actual encounter itself, as it had a huge pool of HP and very high individual stats. Those attributes were then enhanced by numerous other mechanics that were common amongst previous superbosses. One of the most intriguing aspects here came via an ability called Wind Shear. Like many superbosses before, Wind Shear enabled Vercingetorix to perform numerous strikes at the same time, with the default version landing 9 times. Omega Weapon, Paragon, and Angra Mainyu each had similar abilities, and perhaps this was mere coincidence, but those 3 superbosses were all developed by teams working under Yoshinori Kitase. Where Vercingetorix differed, however, was that the potency of Wind Shear could be upgraded as the fight endured. And this represented a significant evolution. During specific health reduction milestones, Vercingetorix would sprout more wings, and each time the power of Wind Shear would increase. By the time Vercingetorix was down to 30% HP, Wind Shear could land a massive 27 times. The enhancement of Wind Shear also highlighted that Vercingetorix was adaptive. At numerous intervals throughout the fight, new abilities started to be introduced, but perhaps the most notable were Putrescence and Wicked Whirl. Alongside this, Vercingetorix also made use of another superboss staple, Doom. Now, it should be said that Doom had a strong mechanical association with Final Fantasy XIII in general, with it often being cast after a specific amount of time had passed during prominent boss encounters. But death-inducing status effects also had a long-running history with superbosses, and Doom could be inflicted by Penance by the Terra Graviton ability. Now, much of this was par for the course based on the established role of superbosses, but Final Fantasy XIII also featured another superboss that served as a throwback to the earlier days of the trope. Longui was a hulking mechanical beast that could be found wandering the world map, and this harkened back to the days of Final Fantasy V, VI, and VII. But similar to Final Fantasy VII, where Ruby and Emerald would only appear after certain progress was made in the game, Longui would only appear after defeating Seath Stones 56 through to 62. Once that criteria was complete, Longui would replace existing hulking beasts known as Adamantatoys and some of the Adamantoys, and it was far more fearsome than either of those two weaker variants. In this regard, there was a loose connection with Ultima and Omega Weapon and Nemesis in Final Fantasy X, as they were all three variants of the same enemy. But the other interesting note here was that Vercingetorix had the same relationship, as it was much stronger than Mithridates and Bituitus, two lesser variants. Longui also had more HP than Vercingetorix and much higher attributes, but it would pose a very different challenge due to its abilities, which included Doom. The main challenge came from Longui's legs. Similar to previous superbosses such as Ruby Weapon, the legs provided a lot of utility and had their own individual health bars. It was only once the legs were defeated that Longui would become suitably vulnerable, and while in this state, Longui would be prohibited from using its powerful Stomp ability. Before we dive into exploring how Final Fantasy Dimensions then introduced a whole host of new superboss traits, a small shout out for our incredible Patreon supporters. Without their support, this channel would not be possible, and we are incredibly grateful. If you would like to support the channel, consider becoming a member of Patreon. For as little as $3 per month, you get access to perks such as watching videos a few days earlier and ad-free. Once this series is complete, we'll also release an audio-only version so that you can listen wherever you want, just like a regular podcast. Now, let's talk about some more superbosses. Final Fantasy Dimensions was developed with a similar mindset to Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light, in that it was meant to pay tribute to the 8-bit and 16-bit games in the series, but here the similar graphical style was even adopted. It meant the quintessential job system was back, and although the story played out using a new episodic format, it still had all the expected beats and a dramatic conclusion. After that conclusion, a new bonus dungeon was unlocked called the Gladiator's Hall, and found within were 3 superbosses. This was quite common, especially when looking back at the re-releases of earlier Final Fantasy games. However, Final Fantasy Dimensions mixed things up by having it so that each superboss had 6 different strength levels. And to increase a superboss's strength, which would see it gain more attributes, have better AI, and also gain access to more abilities, players would need to defeat each superboss twice at the current strength level. It meant to face the toughest version of each superboss, they would need to be defeated 10 times. Adamantoys, Gigantor, and Omega Weapon were the 3 superbosses available to challenge, and each offered something unique from a gameplay perspective. There were also different rewards, but Omega Weapon represented the most difficult test out of the 3. One of the main reasons for this was due to the return of Terror Break. In Final Fantasy VIII, this was a devilish multi-hit move that attacked random targets, and that exact same application returned here. Across the 3, it meant there were some interesting challenges to be faced, and they would each need to be defeated a considerable number of times to gain access to the best equipment in the game. Dissidia Duodecim launched 2 years after the original game, and it served as a significant expansion. It saw a whole host of new playable characters added to the roster, and they took part in an original story arc that focused on another iteration of the continuing conflict between Chaos and Cosmos. After the story was concluded, an additional story mode unlocked, and after that was completed, another story mode unlocked, and it was here that the game's superboss, Feral Chaos, could be faced. Similar to other more recent entries, Feral Chaos could not be faced just one time, but multiple times. Within the third and final story mode, dubbed Confessions of the Creator, it could be faced 2 times, with the second being markedly harder than the first. But Feral Chaos could also be encountered in Time Attack mode via the Crystal Course, and in the Labyrinth, which served as a modified version of the Dual Colosseum that appeared in the original game. Perhaps the most unique aspect around Feral Chaos, however, was that it could also be encountered in another scenario, and that scenario was unlike anything ever seen before in relation to a superboss. When starting the game, should players say they are a Dissidia expert, they will be forced to face Feral Chaos with immediate effect, and only being granted control of a level 1 lightning. It was designed to be an unwinnable battle, and it served as the only such instance of this happening in relation to a superboss to this point, but it was possible to still win. And should this scenario occur, then the game would act accordingly, by placing them at the beginning of the third and final story arc. Final Fantasy IV The After Years initially launched as an episodic mobile game before being transitioned over to the Wii. But with a new version of Final Fantasy IV being worked on for the PlayStation Portable, Square Enix decided to remake The After Years so that the 2 games could be packaged together and be made consistent. This required a load of changes to be made, as the game had to be transitioned over to being a standalone product. But despite so much work being done to make sure this transition was as smooth as possible, there was of course still time for the inclusion of a brand new superboss called Lost Babel. Similar to the superbosses included within the Final Fantasy IV Remake, Lost Babel had some pretty standard requirements players had to complete before it could be squared off against. For example, they would have to have beaten the game first. But there were also some fun nuances too, and these took advantage of the game's design principles to create a superboss that was a bit more unique. Unlike every other non-MMO superboss, due to the scale of Lost Babel, it had to be faced by 3 parties at the same time. This harkened back to other encounters such as Bizarro Sephiroth, but it was of course reminiscent of the many alliance-based superbosses from Final Fantasy XI. The other element was that, similar to some other more recent superbosses such as Minerva, Feral Chaos, and the 3 superbosses found in Dimensions, Lost Babel could be fought against an unlimited number of times. The only caveat was that there was now an entry fee, as to fight Lost Babel, players would need to pump up 500,000 gil. After the release of Final Fantasy IV The Complete Collection, Square Enix continued to support the PlayStation Portable by releasing an original game called Final Fantasy Type 0. Having been announced back in 2006 as Final Fantasy Agato 13, Type 0 ended up having numerous revisions during its time in development. These changes related to the story and overall scope, and even the planned release platform. What gamers witnessed upon release was something quite different from the usual Final Fantasy game. It had a rich story, but there was a heavy focus on action-orientated gameplay, and this meant the notion of superbosses received a slight change. Throughout the illustrious history of Final Fantasy, the majority of games had been turn-based. The only major exceptions to this that also featured superbosses were Dirge's Cerberus and the 2 Dissidia games. And it was the latter of the 3 that would serve as an intriguing inspiration, and this would relate to both of Type 0 superbosses, albeit in different ways. Gilgamesh appeared during the main storyline campaign a few different times, but the true form of Gilgamesh could not be faced until playing Type 0 on New Game Plus. This represented a deviation on the previous New Game Plus criteria, as the superbosses locked behind that requirement could not typically be faced beforehand, but it also melded with Chaos and Feral Chaos, as both could be encountered as part of the story before a stronger version could be faced afterwards. There was also a further separation though, as after Gilgamesh had been faced in New Game Plus via the Machina's Struggle mission, a portal would open on the world map, leading to the Rift. And it was here that the actual superboss could be faced, True Gilgamesh. However, the portal wouldn't actually appear until a 3rd playthrough of the game had been commenced, which served as an evolution of the New Game Plus requirement. The final encounter with True Gilgamesh also came with some other interesting nuances. For example, the player could not control who entered the fight. For every previous superboss, players almost always had complete control over how and when they undertook the encounter. The only real exceptions were accidental encounters such as was possible with Omega or Emerald Weapon. But excluding those mishaps, players were given ample time to prepare and go into each encounter with an optimal setup. Here, however, True Gilgamesh would select a party member at random, and should they be defeated, as if to add salt to the wound, True Gilgamesh would claim the weapon they had equipped as a trophy. The other super boss found in Type 0 was Nox Suzaku, and this fulfilled another trait associated with Feral Chaos. After starting a New Game Plus playthrough, Nox Suzaku appeared during the introductory sequence as Unidentified Target. Similar to Feral Chaos, this was an unwinnable encounter, with the actual fight taking place as the playthrough progressed. Both superbosses also had an element of lore. Gilgamesh was the Black Tortoise Lassie and was immortal. It's unclear how old this makes Gilgamesh, but he was the king of Lorica and was in charge of protecting his country. Nox Suzaku, on the other hand, was a being of unknown origin. According to the lore, it was a fabled being that exists in an adjacent realm. Thus, both fulfill the trait of being ancient and mystical in nature. With Final Fantasy XIII-2 serving as a direct sequel to Final Fantasy XIII, numerous aspects remained the same between both games. This saw many of the same characters return, and the battle system, although modified, had the same fundamental application. And this notion was then extended through to superbosses. Longui returned again as a superboss, and this time it had even more HP than it had before. Yomi then appeared as an alternative to Vercingetorix, featuring similar abilities and a similar design. However, unlike Longui, which was arguably made stronger in Final Fantasy XIII-2, Yomi was weaker than Vercingetorix and could no longer use Doom. But the main challenge, in the base game at least, came from neither of these superbosses. Instead, it was provided by a new entry called Rasputil, which, like Vercingetorix and Yomi, was another member of the Undying, a group of ancient and powerful Seath. Unlike the other superboss encounters faced in the Final Fantasy XIII sub-series to this point, Rasputil had a few tricks up its sleeve, and perhaps the most notable was the ability to call upon allies. At specific points, Rasputil could summon various weaker Seath to assist, and this particular trait had seldom been seen outside of superbosses that featured in Final Fantasy XI. However, unlike in Final Fantasy XI, where bosses such as Kirin and the Archangels used allies to increase the volume of targets and their damage-dealing capabilities, Rasputil had an ulterior motive. Should the player not defeat the summoned Seath quickly enough, Rasputil consumed them, gaining access to a powerful heal. As time passed, the challenge found within Final Fantasy XIII-2 was then increased via its downloadable content, as this added the Colosseum. And in the initial instance, the most notable superbosses added were Snowvilliers and Valfida. The appearance of Snow was quite intriguing, as never before had a superboss been a prior protagonist, or indeed a formerly playable character. The only exception to this could be the Archangels, which represented the player races in Final Fantasy XI, but they were not actual characters in the same way. The fight itself was also unique via the tension mechanic. Snow focused his efforts on just one playable character, and the longer this focus was maintained, the more tension was built. Should this reach 500%, then Snow could use an ability called Sovereign Fist to instantly kill the entire party. Valfida presented a very different challenge, but perhaps the most notable trait was that this challenge could be increased. Similar to the superbosses found within Final Fantasy Dimensions, even though Valfida would start off quite weak, it would get stronger with every defeat. This strength would manifest by an increase in HP, but also physical and magical damage, but Valfida would also gain increased elemental resistances and access to a whole new suite of abilities. But even though both of these encounters were tough for different reasons, another superboss that was arguably even tougher was added via the Clash on the Big Bridge downloadable content. Yes, Gilgamesh returned. Similar to Final Fantasy Type 0, Gilgamesh again had two forms. In the first, which was much weaker, Gilgamesh would use projectile weapons, But in the second, which represented true Gilgamesh, melee weapons would become the focal point. This then brought numerous traits to the fore, as by using each of the different weapons accrued over the years, Gilgamesh was able to deliver a lot of different debilitating status effects, and high amounts of damage. But as more and more damage was dealt to Gilgamesh, his stats would increase, and he would also gain access to new abilities and counters. When Final Fantasy XIV was announced, it came with a high degree of expectation. Final Fantasy XI had been a genre-defining MMO when it first released, and fans were desperate to see whether that same feat could be achieved yet again. Unfortunately, that was not to be the case. It became clear not too long after launch that the development team had not kept up to date with emerging trends in the genre, and such was the backlash that the producer and director were removed from their roles. The PlayStation 3 version was delayed indefinitely, and paid subscriptions were suspended until further notice. After the appointment of Naoki Yoshida, wounds started to heal, and light appeared at the end of the tunnel. Many positive changes were made from this point forward, but with respect to this video, one of the most important came on the 20th of June 2011 via patch 1.22c. As this was when Final Fantasy XIV got its first true superboss, Ifrit. The Bowl of Embers pitted players against Ifrit, and it was available within the original release of Final Fantasy XIV, forming part of the main scenario quest. Due to the nature of this trial, the base version was balanced towards those progressing through the main story, but in patch 1.22b, a more difficult version was introduced via the Bowl of Embers Hard. This presented a much more difficult challenge, as the level cap was raised and much stronger gear was required. But just as players were adjusting to this change, patch 1.22c was released, and this introduced the Bowl of Embers Extreme. Ifrit now had a much greater HP pool and a considerable boost in attack power. Ifrit would also use more ability patterns much earlier in the fight compared to the hard version, making use of Hellfire on a semi-regular basis to try and achieve victory. But Ifrit also made use of enhanced regular abilities such as Seer and Eruption. Perhaps the most notable part of the fight, however, in terms of comparisons with previous superbosses, related to Ifrit's horns. Similar to the likes of Long Gui in recent memory, the strength of Ifrit and its abilities was determined by something else. And in this case, if the horns were left intact, Ifrit's damage-dealing potency was elevated, with some abilities even made unavoidable. Each instance of the Bowl of Embers then returned in Final Fantasy XIV when it was relaunched as Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. But the Extreme version was not added into the game until patch 2.1, and due to numerous gameplay changes, its relative difficulty was reduced. Regardless, those who wanted a challenge didn't even have to wait to tackle this new version of Ifrit, as the base version of Final Fantasy XIV received a brand new superboss that was on par with the original version of Ifrit. And this superboss appeared as part of a raid called the Binding Coil of Bahamut. At launch, this raid consisted of 5 sequential instances of increasing difficulty, and at the conclusion of turn 5, players would be tasked with defeating a superboss called Twintania. This in itself was a significant evolution on the superboss concept. There have been a few instances before of sequential encounters, and players on the odd occasion have been tasked with defeating back-to-back superbosses, such as with Paragon and Trema in Final Fantasy X-2 and the Judge Magisters in Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac Job System. But never had they had to overcome a challenging pre-trial before then having to defeat such a brutal foe at its conclusion. Twintania itself was fought across 5 separate phases, each with distinct abilities and patterns that players were required to become familiar with, and, as had now become quite common with superbosses, those phases were dictated by how much Twintania's health had been reduced. Outside of numerous allies joining Twintania during the encounter, perhaps the most difficult aspect though was how easy it was to suffer an instant death, with the Twisters being quite notorious in this regard. Twintania also had the ability to inflict numerous debilitating status effects such as Death Sentence and the equivalent of the Doom Countdown from Final Fantasy XIII. After 13 minutes, Twintania would become enraged, using an ability called Etheric Profusion relentlessly until all players were downed. And due to the frequency of its use, the chances of achieving victory after this point became rather diminished. Even though Lightning Returns was developed as the third game in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, instead of introducing further refinements, the decision was taken to make some pretty significant changes compared to the two previous games. This meant there was an adapted gameplay system, and the general structure was modified, and it meant we got two brand new superbosses. However, there was still a connection with the previous game, and this was similar to how some of the superbosses in Final Fantasy XIII-2 were connected with 13. In this instance, Aeronite was based on an enemy called Feral, and the odd element here was that even though it wasn't a superboss itself in that game, Feral did have a connection with Longui. Aeronite also continued the association between the 13 trilogy and superbosses being encountered in the field, as it could be found wandering around the dead dunes. But, similar to the older superbosses such as Emerald Weapon, Aeronite only appeared after a certain amount of progress had been made in the game. In this instance, players needed to progress to Day 7. The encounter itself came with a few different nuances. For example, Aeronite would adjust its strategy based on proximity. This was similar to how Yiazmat adapted should the player party tried to create some distance. But whereas Yiazmat took the time to heal and self-buff, Aeronite was much more aggressive, using the Black Hole ability to suck lightning back into the fray and stop any attempt at escape. The other intriguing aspect around Aeronite wasn't so much that it adapted its abilities as the battle progressed, it was more what instigated the adaptation. Often, specific superboss phases were dictated by health being reduced to a certain point, or being depleted before then being refilled. Here, however, Aeronite changed its attack patterns based on how many times it had been staggered. Alongside Aeronite, Lightning Returns also featured another superboss called Ereshkigal. Unlike Aeronite, Ereshkigal could not be found in the field. Instead, it was hidden inside a bonus dungeon called the Ultimate Layer, which could only be unlocked after Lightning had completed enough side quests. Although it was never confirmed via in-game lore, Ereshkigal had the appearance of a Seath, and it was dummied out in both Final Fantasy XIII and XIII-2. Based on that, it theoretically served as a continuation of the Undying, and even though it didn't use the same model, there were similarities with Vercingetorix and Yomi. Perhaps the most obvious parallel was its use of a multi-hit ability that could see its application enhanced. With Vercingetorix, this came via the ability called Wind Shear, with the number of hits determined by how many wings had been sprouted. Ereshkigal had a very different application. Its multi-hit ability was Meteor, but in its standard form, this only landed one hit. However, should it gather enough charge, then Meteor could be enhanced to first Mega Meteor, going all the way up to Exameteor, which landed 15 strikes. This could deal huge amounts of damage, but it wasn't Ereshkigal's only multi-hit ability, as Resonance landed over 10 strikes, with each strike dealing more damage than the last. Similar to Aeronite, Ereshkigal also had phases dictated by the number of staggers, with barriers introduced and removed throughout the various stagger phases of the encounter. The other element that made Aeronite and Ereshkigal quite unique though, was that they could be faced in 3 different ways. There had been notions before of superbosses being enhanced through successive encounters, and Minerva in Crisis Core introduced the elevation of challenge based on difficulty setting. Lightning Returns pushed this even further by offering a hard variant for each superboss, but also an easy variant for those who perhaps found the challenge to be too great based on their current skill level, but still wanted to be challenged nonetheless. By the end of the 2000s, the Final Fantasy XI active subscriber base was starting to decline, and it no longer became viable to create standalone expansions that were releasing every year, as had been the case up until the release of Wings of the Goddess. The development team still wanted to keep players engaged, however, and alongside the introduction of strong notorious monsters such as Dark Ixion and the Providence Watcher, this saw them work on smaller expansions. In the initial sense, these came via add-on scenarios that were more focused on story and offered limited gameplay challenges. But in 2010, Abyssius started to roll out, and these add-on packs had a primary focus on gameplay. By 2013, the game's 5th expansion had been launched. It was called Seekers of Adulin, and it continued the notion of trying to elevate gameplay challenges. In December 2013, this then manifested through a brand new piece of content called High-Tier Mission Battles. The idea was to introduce the classic battles from the game's past in a controlled environment, while also elevating the challenge. And this saw the likes of the Archangels and the Divine Might encounter resurfaced from Rise of the Zilart, as well as Odin Prime and a whole host of other avatars. Shinryu, one of the toughest encounters from Abyssia, also resurfaced. Much like Lightning Returns, in the initial instance, players were able to tackle these superbosses on various difficulties, including very easy, easy, and normal, and the rewards were good. However, once the encounter was completed, players were then able to tackle them on difficult and very difficult. Due to the nature of these encounters, it meant there wasn't just one superboss, there were countless. But should they be felled on the very difficult level, honorary title was granted to the victor. When Final Fantasy IV The After Years was remade for the PlayStation Portable, the original mobile and Wii re-releases were bolstered up in almost every way. But even though this version was quite definitive, Square Enix ended up in a bit of a pickle. They had chosen to release the Final Fantasy IV 3D remake on smartphones and PC, as opposed to the 2D PSP version. They therefore felt that releasing the 2D version of the After Years as a follow-up to the 3D version of the remake would have created a considerable disconnect. So, they decided to remake the After Years in the exact same style as the 3D remake. But they didn't just stop there, as this new version of the After Years included many other changes, such as a minimap, autosave functionality, New Game Plus, and perhaps most interestingly, the removal of all of the extra challenge dungeons. But even though the dungeons were removed, that didn't stop the developers from introducing a whole new array of superbosses. And perhaps the most intriguing note here is that they were ported over from another game. The PSP version of Final Fantasy IV introduced the Lunar Eidolons as a group of tough bosses that served as a precursor to squaring off against Zeromus EG. 4 of the Lunar Eidolons were then carried forward to the 3D remake of the After Years. Each of them guarded a specific ability or piece of equipment within the game's final dungeon, and this was a fascinating detail. Earlier in the days of superbosses, it was not uncommon for them to be found within the game's penultimate or final dungeon. Prominent examples here were Omega and Shinryu, but also Omega Weapon and even Hades. But after a certain point, superbosses started to more commonly reside within bonus dungeons, or they were locked behind a specific set of increasingly difficult requirements. The 3D remake of the After Years reverted back to type, and they also increased this notion by having each of the Lunar Eidolons protect something, including powerful abilities and equipment. As individual fights, the other curious element was that they mirrored the 2D counterparts, having identical HP pools and the same abilities. But the 3D versions also had a load of supplemental abilities that they could use on top. This element then helped to classify the newer iterations of the Lunar Eidolons as tougher foes within their specific gameplay system, and it also showed that the notion of superbosses had continued to evolve. No longer were developers satisfied with creating original superbosses or paying homage to the past. Instead, we started to see numerous instances of older superbosses being brought forward to the modern day with a higher degree of frequency, with them then being adapted to their new environment. The other interesting element was the notion of superbosses being upgradable. They were no longer designed to be one-and-done encounters. Instead, superbosses were created to be recurring encounters that could even increase in challenge after being defeated. This fundamental change was then elevated further following the release of Yoshida's new vision for Final Fantasy XIV, but it also carried over to many other games, just in different ways. But with such dynamic shifts continuing to be seen, it just shows why this particular topic is one that captures the imagination. We still have a long way to go though, as Final Fantasy XIV is only just getting started. After its revival as Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, the development team sought to engage players with consistent updates. These updates were designed to both enhance and enrich the story, but also challenge players in new and innovative ways. One such example was the Behemoth level 50 fate, but raids such as the Binding Coil of Bahamut were where the real challenge could be found. As A Realm Reborn progressed, patch 2.1 and 2.2 furthered this notion by introducing extreme versions of trials, akin to what was seen before the launch of A Realm Reborn, and it brought forth the next iteration of the Coil of Bahamut, dubbed the Second Coil of Bahamut. This served as another challenging raid, with Nail Deus Darnus, the final boss of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, returning as a tough encounter. And this mirrored some other games, such as Dissidia, where the final boss was also transformed into a separate super boss. But it was patch 2.3 where things took a much darker turn, as the second Coil of Bahamut Savage was released. Nail Deus Darnus again served as the final boss of this raid, but the challenge was now elevated in a few different ways. For one, positioning was very important now, as a barrier surrounded the battlefield, and should any player touch this, they would suffer an instant KO. This was quite an intriguing addition, as instant KO had been a hallmark trait of superbosses for years, but it was often delivered via specific moves. Here, it was part of the overall makeup of the encounter. Beyond this, Nail Deus Darnus also had the same 13-minute enrage timer as Twintania, and the regular version of Nail from patch 2.2, and there were multiple phases based on health which determined actions taken. The coup de grace of A Realm Reborn was then Bahamut Prime, who was fought at the conclusion of the final Coil of Bahamut. This raid was added as part of patch 2.4, but outside of introducing new abilities that players needed to be mindful of, the general setup was much the same as the previous raids, with a set enrage timer and ability sets that changed according to health milestones. It was perhaps for this reason that the world first clear time for the final Coil of Bahamut was much quicker than the raids added in previous patches. Patch 2.5 then added another superboss contender, Odin. Perhaps as a way of paying tribute to Final Fantasy XI, where Odin was introduced as a tough superboss as part of the Treasures of Artugan expansion, Odin returned as a very challenging level 50 fate. What made this particular fate quite special was the size and scale of the encounter, but beyond that, there were a few intriguing aspects. For one, when the fate was active, a unique weather called tension affected the wider area. Odin could also use a few debuffs, but perhaps the most prominent aspect was that when Odin's health dropped low enough, he started to charge Zantetsuken, and much like in Final Fantasy XI, if Odin was not defeated before the charge time ended, anyone participating in the fate would be instantly killed. After the release of patch 2.5, the Final Fantasy XIV development team continued to release new content for the game, including the Gold Saucer, but eyes were also on the game's first major expansion, dubbed Heavensward. Players were excited to explore the new areas made available and see how the new jobs handled, but they were, of course, also excited to see if they could overcome the new challenges Heavensward would offer. Thankfully, they wouldn't have to wait long, as just over a month after launch, patch 3.05 introduced the Alexander Gordius Savage Raid series. Similar to the Bahamut raids, there were numerous turns that needed to be completed, and upon making their way to the final part, they faced off against the Manipulator. The fight itself had a hard enrage and featured numerous phases, and this was similar to Twintania, Nail Deus Darnus, and Bahamut Prime. But the difference here was with how the phases changed. Instead of them being based on specific health reduction levels, players were required to defeat the Manipulator's appendages first, and this was quite unique. It was not uncommon for superbosses to have multiple appendages. This had been a thing ever since Ruby Weapon. However, they had seldom been mandatory to defeat in order to obtain victory, with perhaps the only grey area here being Longui in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. The major difference here was therefore that not only was defeating the appendages mandatory, but players actually had choice over which appendage they defeated first. The other unique aspect was that once a leg was defeated, players then had a small window where they could attack the Manipulator, before then having to defeat one of the other remaining appendages. And this would also bring about a new phase in the boss fight, a cycle that continued until all appendages were defeated. After numerous forays into the mobile gaming space, Square Enix started to find their feet with an array of releases that included Mobius and Brave Exvius. But before both of those games, Square Enix released another title called Record Keeper. Alongside the story, players were kept busy with numerous collection events that challenged players in different ways and offered some fun rewards. In early June of 2015, this notion was enhanced via bonus battles, which started with the Plus difficulty. A month later, Plus difficulty was introduced, but the real spike came with the introduction of Plus battles towards the end of the year. The first Plus bonus battle was centered around Final Fantasy IV, with Dark Bahamut appearing as the final boss of that particular bonus run. But it was the bonus battle that came just after, called Ultimate Guardian, that pushed players to the limit. Players were tasked with defeating stages of increasing difficulty, with the final stage seeing them square off against the Sanctuary Keeper. And what made the challenge so extreme was the capacity for bosses like the Sanctuary Keeper to just tear through the entire party in one turn. At launch, it meant the content was quite brutal, and it took players some time to figure out how to compensate for the harsh tactics employed by the final stage of these plus bonus battles. As Final Fantasy XI entered into its twilight years, the developers wanted to go out with a bang. Rhapsodies of Vana'diel was planned to be the final major storyline update, and it saw new chapters released throughout 2015. However, the developers were not done with the game after these updates were released. They wanted to continue to keep players engaged. They just planned to do this via content updates as opposed to scenario updates. In May 2016, this saw the arrival of the Master Trials. Building upon the notion of the high-tier mission battles, Master Trials were purpose-designed encounters that were created to appeal to players who had just about completed all other aspects of the game and were looking for something else to tackle. It meant that the Master Trials were intended to cater to a select bunch of players, and the rewards reflected this, as they offered custom in-battle cosmetics to the victors. As the game then continued to receive updates, the Master Trials ended up becoming a focal point, and they remained ready and waiting for new challenges. While Final Fantasy XI was building out its Master Trials, Final Fantasy XIV was continuing to pump out content relating to Heavensward. And as the expansion reached its conclusion, so too did its Alexander-centric raid series. Much like A Realm Reborn had the final Coil of Bahamut, this saw the third and final Alexander raid series released as part of patch 3.4. It was called Alexander the Creator Savage, with the final raid instance being called the Soul of the Creator. And waiting for players at the end of this punishing raid was none other than Alexander Prime. However, it wasn't just Alexander. Although players would square off against the legendary summon at the beginning of the encounter, once the first phase had been concluded, Alexander disappeared, replaced by lesser minions. By this point in the franchise, it had become quite common for superbosses to call upon enemies to support them in combat, with Rasputil even absorbing them to gain some health back. But they had never appeared in place of a superboss before, as, well, the superboss was meant to be the main event. During the third phase, Alexander Prime regained that main event status, as it sprouted wings and caused continual pain for parties. This came via debuffs that felt relentless due to their large AoE circles, but also the tethering mechanics at play. Perhaps the most unique aspect of the encounter, though, came during Phase 4, thanks to the time gate mechanic. Alexander Prime summoned 4 support minions, which then entered a time gate. Players were then required to defeat these minions before Divine Judgment could be cast, but the unique aspect here was that players had to actually enter the time gates, which took them to a separate instance, and nothing like this had ever been seen before. World of Final Fantasy, in many ways, was a breath of fresh air for the franchise. It fought against the relentless push for action-orientated gameplay and brought back the traditional active time battle system, enhancing it via the stacking mechanic. There was also a very cutesy art style, and on the surface, this made World of Final Fantasy seem like a game that was geared less towards the hardcore. But as the narrative developed, the story became more mature, and the gameplay became much more challenging. This notion then manifested in the most extreme sense via a superboss that was simply called XG. XG could be found within the EX Dungeon Z, one of the game's bonus dungeons. This was pretty standard, but there was something about XG that was very much the opposite of being standard, and that related to the superboss's etymology. Every prior superboss had been a unique creation or a reference of some kind to a previous entity known within the Final Fantasy universe. But here, the superboss was a reference to another IP owned by Square Enix, Xenogears. The other unique aspect relating to XG was that after the fight concluded, due to the wider gameplay mechanics, the reward for winning the encounter was that XG joined the team as a mirage. And this then meant that players could use the superboss to enhance their own party. Now, even though Record Keeper came first, Brave Exvius took mobile gaming by storm, at least when looking at it from a Final Fantasy perspective. There had been numerous games released before Brave Exvius, but none were as rich and detailed, and it led to the game receiving a huge following that dwarfed the other equivalent properties being produced by Square Enix. Part of this was due to the fundamentals driving the game. Brave Exvius was based on an already established game called Brave Frontier, which was produced by Aelim. Square Enix then worked with Aelim to produce a Final Fantasy equivalent, but it was heavily modified to appeal to that specific audience. And this meant alongside the story, it featured solid gameplay options and of course, plenty of challenges to keep players engaged. For a while, this challenge felt quite reasonable and within the bounds of the game. But there always comes a point where the challenge increases at an uncomfortable pace, and in Brave Exvius, one of the most notable instances of this came with the launch of an event called Trials of the Creator. What made the encounter so tough was the sheer damage output from Maxwell, the superboss in question. At this point in Brave Exvius' life cycle, there weren't too many characters who could serve as breakers, but without one, Maxwell was nigh impossible to defeat. The other curious element at play here was that Maxwell was also not a character original to either Brave Exvius or Final Fantasy in general. Similar to XG, Maxwell was related to another IP, and in this case, it was Brave Frontier, the game that inspired Brave Exvius. Final Fantasy XV arrived towards the end of 2016 after a rather tumultuous development cycle that had lasted over a decade. Due to its origins as Final Fantasy Versus 13, its structure and gameplay style had quite a few differences in comparison to previous mainline entries, but that didn't mean the developers skimped in areas fans expected, and this meant there were numerous superbosses created as a way of testing players. Perhaps the most notorious in this regard has to be the Adamantoys. Reappearing as a superboss, this iteration of the Adamantoys referenced a few different prior superbosses. The most obvious has to be Longui in Final Fantasy XIII, as the Adamantoys was huge and could therefore be found on the world map. But the other notable reference here was Yiazmat due to the intense size of Adamantoys' HP pool. At launch, this meant players could end up spending hours upon hours attempting to defeat the Adamantoys, and it was even joked about pre-launch that it could take days, something that evoked uncomfortable memories of Pandemonium Warden. Perhaps due to the severity of the encounter, the Adamantoys was then adjusted just after 6 months after the launch of Final Fantasy XV. This came via patch 1.06, although it was an inadvertent patch, as instead of nerfing the Adamantoys, the patch introduced a significant weakness that allowed players to defeat it in just one move. And this was because the patch removed enemy immunities to Alterna, a move available through the Ring of the Lucii. It would still take quite a few tries thanks to random number generation, but this meant the Adamantoys could be defeated in mere minutes as opposed to hours, with the player barely needing to lift a finger. The other two superbosses featured in Final Fantasy XV also harkened back to superbosses of old. Naglfar, for example, was fought at the end of an extensive line of side quests that were akin to the hunt system in Final Fantasy XII and XIII. MAX Angelus Zero then referenced Warmech and the Iron Giant, the old superbosses from the earlier Final Fantasy games. And this was because, unlike almost every other superboss ever featured throughout the illustrious history of the franchise, MAX Angelus Zero was a random encounter dropped from airships during Chapter 15 on unsuspecting and unfortunate foes. One of the other interesting aspects around this superboss related to its damage limitation capabilities, as even the Colossal Astrals were unable to deal high damage figures. Now in the background, while games like World of Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy XV kept players occupied with standalone offline experiences, Record Keeper was continuing to challenge its player base at an increasing pace. Almost as soon as the +++ difficulty bonus battles were introduced, they were surpassed by Ultimate difficulty. But compared to the previous jump, it was much more manageable and expected. The next major jump therefore came in May of 2017 following the arrival of Apocalypse difficulty bonus battles, with the entry point being another Final Fantasy X themed event called Dreaming's End. What made this specific event stand out was that it harkened back to some previous superbosses that were faced as a gauntlet, and for this battle, players had to fight against Valfor, Ifrit, and Ixion back to back, with Ixion being by far the hardest due to his ultimate Aerospark ability. Not to be left out with the ongoing power creep within Square Enix's persistent mobile games, Brave Exvius went through something of a punishing event gauntlet itself. A month after Record Keeper had its Dreaming's End event, Brave Exvius went live with Attack of the Gilgamesh, and this saw the notorious antagonist return yet again. Similar to previous instances of Gilgamesh appearing as a superboss, the fight was brutal, and one of the main reasons was the ability called Bushido Freedom. Not only did this ability inflict an instant KO on one party member, it also did 5 times hybrid damage to all surviving party members, and removed all of their positive status effects. Gilgamesh also had 1 million HP, which was quite hefty at the time. However, even though the encounter was tough, it paled in comparison to Rumble of the Malboro. This saw everyone's favourite enemy, the Great Malboro, appearing as a punishing superboss that had 10 million HP. But what made the fight hard wasn't so much the Great Malboro and its high HP pool, it was the requirement for the players to fight off all of the regular Malboro at the same time, as they each had 4 million HP and had plenty of their own horrible abilities to punish the party with. After the incredible story arc of Heavensward, Final Fantasy XIV had started to gain some real momentum, and after the announcement of the game's second expansion, Stormblood, fans were expectant. They wanted to see how the developers could up the ante even further. From the perspective of superbosses, there were some tough challenges towards the start, with some S-rank elite marts and some punishing fates, including the likes of Ixion. There were also some new trials added, and a new Savage Raid series. But much of this was par for the course in terms of what had already been seen from Final Fantasy XIV up until this point. The developers, however, were just teasing players, and the true test of Stormblood was unveiled as part of patch 4.11, following the appearance of the first ultimate raid called the Unending Coil of Bahamut. Unlike the previous challenging raids, the Unending Coil of Bahamut only consisted of a single encounter, and that encounter pitted players against 3 previous Final Fantasy XIV superbosses in a sequential encounter. Yes, players needed to beat Twintania, Nail Deus Darnus, and Bahamut Prime back to back, and they then needed to fight Twintania and Nail at the same time. This was a pretty significant evolution on the previous concept of sequential superboss encounters. But that wasn't the end, as after the defeat of Twintania and Nail, Golden Bahamut Prime appeared as the true superboss. Further to this, prior to the appearance of Golden Bahamut, the party had a forced wipe due to the power of Terra Flare. The party would then be brought back by Phoenix and given Phoenix Blessing, as well as a full limit break gauge. But if Bahamut was not brought down to 60% health before the Twintania and Nail phase started, Golden Bahamut was given a significant damage buff that would make the encounter almost impossible to win. Should Golden Bahamut also not be defeated before it completed 5 sequences of its ability set, it became enraged, also making the encounter nearly impossible to win. Even though Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 was positioned as a follow-up to the original game, significant changes were made to almost every single aspect, and alongside the narrative and gameplay systems, this also related to superbosses. In Dimensions, 3 superbosses could be found within a bonus location called the Gladiator's Hall. Dimensions 2 altered this by having its most powerful superbosses appear within the Babel Tower. In the initial free-to-play version of Dimensions 2, there was a training location that could be accessed every day. But there were limits placed on how often the stages could be tackled to work in with the typical mechanics of supply and demand in mobile games. Alongside the easier training stages was the Babel Tower, and this worked in much the same way, albeit with tougher enemies and better rewards. As time passed, more and more levels were added to the Babel Tower, and they featured increasingly tougher enemies. When Dimensions 2 was then transitioned from a free-to-play game to a standalone game, the Babel Tower was retained. New floors were now unlocked as progress was made throughout the main game, but the hardest floors were reserved as post-game content. Similar to Trial Mode from Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac job system, the challenge kept getting harder and harder. But the major difference here was that almost every encounter faced on a post-game floor could be considered a superboss. Floor 36, for example, contained a fight against Omega, with there also being encounters against Chaos and Ultimate Weapon. The final floor then saw players square off against Proto-Babil, the superboss from both the Final Fantasy IV Remake and Final Fantasy the Four Heroes of Light, which were of course two games that the team had previously worked on. And similar to what was seen in the past, Proto-Babil ended up being a multi-phase encounter where its different body parts needed to be defeated. Perhaps one of the most unique aspects around Dimensions 2 though, was that many of the superbosses required specific members of the party to be present, and this represented a fun twist on Type 0, where Gilgamesh selected a specific party member to square off against. After the release of Final Fantasy XV, the development team got straight back to work on delivering their ambitious rollout for downloadable content. There were 3 story-driven episodes that were used to help fill in some of the noticeable gaps in the story, but perhaps the most intriguing expansion was Comrades. Whereas the rest of the game was focused on single-player party-based combat, Comrades turned Final Fantasy XV into a multiplayer experience where you could create a member of the Kingsglaive and fight alongside other members of your ilk who were controlled by real people from around the world. Given the adjusted nature of the experience and its ever-evolving nature, the developers wanted to make sure there were plenty of challenges for people to tackle. And to keep things consistent, MAX Angelus Zero returned as a challenging superboss. Encounterable as a training mission in the Nordoskine garrison, what made this particular fight challenging ended up being a throwback to Type 0, as MAX Angelus Zero had to be fought one-on-one, just like true Gilgamesh. Not long after the launch of the Comrades multiplayer expansion, Square Enix then launched Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition and Windows Edition. Part of the appeal was that this new version came with all the paid and free downloadable content packed in, but there were also a few surprises thrown in to tempt back those who had already bought the game before. And one of those surprises came in the form of a brand new superboss called Omega. The general appearance was congruent with what might be expected from Omega, but additional lore was added that aligned Omega with the ancient civilization of Solheim, and this represented a nice twist. Its defeat also granted the Omega badge as a way of cementing the reference. Alongside this, Omega was then added as a superboss in Comrades. As one Final Fantasy multiplayer experience continued to develop and expand, so too did another. After the release of the unending Coil of Bahamut, the Final Fantasy XIV player base were curious to see where the developers would take Stormblood next. Patch 4.2 brought a brand new Savage raid, and patch 4.31 brought a new Ultimate raid called the Weapons Refrain. But while both of these posed significant challenges, albeit for different reasons, the next major superboss came alongside the release of patch 4.4. AlphaScape version 4.0 Savage served as the conclusion of the AlphaScape raid series, and in this regard it was similar to the previous high-tier raids. As such, this was where the most challenging encounter was housed, and it saw players square off against Omega M and Omega F. On the surface, this was similar to the unending Coil of Bahamut and the Four Heroes of Light, as it meant multiple superbosses were encountered at the same time. Compared to those previous instances though, there was a significant hike up in challenge, with countless abilities, patterns and weaknesses that needed to be memorized and adapted to. There was also an evolution of the concept, as after defeating Omega M and Omega F, the final form of Omega surfaced. And this represented the only instance thus far of two superbosses merging into a single, more powerful superboss as part of the same fight. What also made the encounter complex was the sheer volume of potential abilities, evolutions of existing abilities, and how those abilities combined. Cascading Latent Defect, for example, could even end in a complete wipe should it not be handled in the correct manner. Now, a few years after the release of World of Final Fantasy, the developers sought to bring the game to new audiences. The original version was released on PlayStation devices exclusively, with a Windows version launching the following year. But towards the end of 2018, World of Final Fantasy was re-released on the Switch and Xbox One as World of Final Fantasy Maxima, with the Maxima portion also being made available as downloadable content for the existing version except the Vita, as it was too large. On that basis, Maxima added a boatload of content, including Nightmare difficulty, a new secret ending, and of course, a handful of new superbosses. And perhaps the most intriguing was Enna Crow. Enna had been a powerful ally throughout the main scenario, serving as one of the primary motivators for Ren and Lan. She was also a god, something that was doubled down on via her in-game character description, but she tried her hardest not to get involved in a direct capacity, choosing to assist the party in more subtle ways. It was therefore quite surprising that Enna Crow not only appeared as a superboss after clearing the postscript, but that she was assisted by Tama and Seraphi. And alongside this fulfilling the trait of a superboss being supported by minions, there were some other interesting nuances. For one, once Enna Crow was defeated, she would be revived back to full health by Tama's Time Walk ability. And this served as a clear parallel to the Kaiser Dragon from Final Fantasy VI Advance. In that instance, once the Kaiser Dragon had been defeated or enough time had passed, it would use Barrier Change to reset its HP back up to maximum and bringing about a new attack phase. Here, Tama would continue to revive Enna Crow until Time Walk had been used 8 times. Only then could the superboss be defeated. The other interesting note, however, was that Time Walk wasn't exclusively associated with Enna Crow. Tama could use the ability if any of the enemy combatants were defeated, including itself. Seraphi also reintroduced the notion of a superboss adapting to the player. By using Rumor Radar, Seraphi alerted Enna Crow to whatever elemental weakness the current party setup had, and once locked in, Enna Crow would follow up with the appropriate elemental spell to exploit that weakness. The next superboss could only be fought after defeating XG, the superboss from the main game, as this was the prerequisite to unlocking the hidden dungeon. Inside, players could find Garland. But similar to the fight against Enna Crow, Garland was not alone, as he was accompanied in the fight by the 4 Fiends. This fight also featured an adaptive nature, as Garland adjusted his moveset and elemental weaknesses based on how many of the 4 Fiends remained, and which ones had been defeated so far. For example, should the player defeat Lich, then Garland would gain a -100 elemental weakness to the Earth element and gain access to the Earthquake ability. The other interesting element around Garland versus Enna Crow was that Garland, similar to XG, could then be used as an ally upon defeat. Another superboss, called the Immortal Dark Dragon, could be squared off against by solving a puzzle. After navigating inside a new portal that appeared within the Crystal Tower, players were tasked with activating 6 elemental switches around the world. After doing so, and re-entering the portal, players found the Immortal Dark Dragon waiting for them. The Immortal Dark Dragon had a considerable pool of HP and could use Dark Summon Replica to bring forth numerous copies of itself, each of which acted independently. But perhaps the most curious aspect was that upon being defeated, the Immortal Dark Dragon had one final trick: Dragon Dive. This powerful ability had the potential to catch unprepared players by surprise due to the damage-dealing potential, and it could also serve as a bitter pill for those who thought they'd won, only to be defeated by its final attack. Upon the defeat of Enna Crow, Garland, and the Immortal Dark Dragon, a final superboss then unlocked. And this fulfilled a trait now seen numerous times, as the final superboss was X9 Bahamut, the game's main antagonist. However, this time X9 Bahamut had 2 forms and was much stronger, with new abilities and different elemental weaknesses. Defeating this souped-up version of X9 Bahamut then granted a type of new reward, as it unlocked a new post-credit scene. The other aspect worth mentioning here was that, like a few other superbosses such as Minerva in Crisis Core and those that featured in Lightning Returns, the superbosses in Maxima could be made even harder if tackled on Nightmare difficulty, which was only available via New Game Plus. By the release of World of Final Fantasy Maxima, games like Record Keeper and Brave Exvius were well into their operational runs. And as players continued to spend money and pour more and more time into each game, the developers had to keep bringing forth new challenges to keep them occupied. In Record Keeper, it saw the arrival of Armageddon difficulty bonus battles throughout 2018. But the next major hike up in difficulty came via the Magicite dungeons, which could only be unlocked after completing the Nightmare dungeons. And Brave Exvius continued its theme of having challenging encounters come via collaborations, with Marchenko from Deus Ex and the Dragon Lord from Dragon Quest serving as two prominent examples. Final Fantasy XIV also continued to expand, the Shadowbringers arriving as the third expansion during the middle of 2019. But even though numerous challenges were introduced at launch, such as Forbidden Rebellion as a new elite mark, the first significant test came via the Epic of Alexander, which was introduced alongside patch 5.11. Much like the previous Ultimate raids, the Epic of Alexander tasked players with defeating a deluge of tough enemies back to back as part of a continuous encounter. First, they had to tackle Living Liquid, then Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser before Alexander Prime returned. During this third phase, similar to Weapons Refrain and Alphascape, numerous puzzle components were introduced to try and make the encounter far more challenging. And after navigating this, the true superboss emerged, Perfect Alexander. Alongside the devilish abilities, each with their own unique puzzles, Alexander, similar to the immortal Dark Dragon in World of Final Fantasy Maxima, called forth numerous clones, and this further complicated the encounter. With so many foes, overlapping abilities and on-screen cues, keeping track of everything going on proved to be quite challenging. And to clear the raid and figure out all the nuances involved, players ended up using third-party tools to edit waymarks. This was not punished at the time, but Square Enix did remove this ability upon the launch of patch 5.2. After many years of waiting and expectation building, the Final Fantasy VII Remake released in April of 2020. But one of the questions that needed answering amongst hardcore enthusiasts was, how could the game incorporate superbosses? The original game featured some now legendary superbosses in Ruby and Emerald Weapon, but they only appeared much later in the original game. With the Final Fantasy VII Remake only tackling Midgar, it was impossible for them to feature, so the development team had to come up with something original. Packed within the game were numerous challenges that presented themselves via Chadley's VR missions, Don Corneo's Colosseum, and the Shinra Combat Simulator missions. But to gain access to the final VR simulator mission, dubbed 3-Person Team vs Top Secrets, players had to finish every challenge in the Colosseum and the Combat Simulator. The other caveat was that this mission only became available during New Game Plus, specifically when playing on hard difficulty. Even though multi-stage encounters were now quite common within the MMO space, they weren't anywhere near as prevalent within the offline entries. But 3-Person Team vs Top Secrets tasked players with overcoming 4 separate stages before being able to even face off against the new superboss called Pride and Joy. However, in a weird twist, Pride and Joy was not the most challenging aspect of the mission, as in the round before, players were tasked with defeating Bahamut and Ifrit at the same time, which was far more difficult. Pride and Joy also had significant weaknesses, as it was vulnerable to lightning damage, and it only had a few abilities that were well telegraphed and quite easy to avoid. This meant Pride and Joy served as the first real instance of an anticlimactic superboss, as although it was challenging as a single enemy, it served more as a reprieve than a further heightening of the overall experience. It was perhaps for this reason that a brand new superboss was introduced via Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, the enhanced version of the game that was released on the PlayStation 5. The unlock method was quite similar here, as supplemental content had to be completed. However, the difference this time around was that the content was part of Episode Intermission, the downloadable content, as opposed to the main game, which was where the superboss had to be fought. Only after Yuffie's episode was complete could the player then gain access to a new combat simulator challenge against Vyse the Immaculate. Unlike Pride and Joy, Vyse had no obvious weakness, and even had heavy resistance to physical and magical damage. This meant the only way of hurting Vyse was to inflict a stagger, but even this posed a challenge, as Vyse had a move called Rejuvenation, which reduced his stagger gauge over time. VIII also used brutal abilities such as Immaculate End, which dealt maximum damage to all party members, bringing about an immediate game over should some kind of re-raise not be in effect. In short, VIII more than made up for Pride and Joy's lackluster showing. He did, however, have a weakness: Tifa. Due to Tifa's ability to increase stagger at an incredible rate, and to increase stagger damage, she could be employed to wreck VIII in a very small amount of time. And when combined with the damage dealing capabilities of other party members, it's even possible to defeat VIII in less than 30 seconds. After the relaunch of Final Fantasy XIV as A Realm Reborn, the development team had managed to keep a pretty consistent release schedule for expansions. It saw Heavensward release 2 years later, and Stormblood and Shadowbringers release with a similar cadence. The plan was, no doubt, for Endwalker to follow the same trend, but production suffered numerous delays due to an unexpected global event. This meant Endwalker launched towards the end of 2021, and its initial content and immediate patches followed a similar trend. This meant some challenging fates were added, some new hunts came, and in patch 6.05, a new Savage Raid was added. However, the first major test didn't arrive until patch 6.11, and it came via a new ultimate dungeon called Dragonsong's Reprise. The general structure of the raid was similar to previous ultimate raids. This meant it was a multi-stage encounter that increased in difficulty upon the completion of each phase. However, unlike the previous ultimate raids, which had 4 or 5 clear phases, Dragonsong's Reprise had 7. And to up the ante even further, there was now an intermission. After defeating Phase 4, players saw time rewind, and they ended up back at Phase 1, or at least that's how it seemed at first glance. Superbosses had numerous forms before depending on how the fight was initiated, and of course many had featured numerous forms during the fight itself, but there had never been a scenario where the fight had reset. However, as alluded to, it wasn't quite the same. There was now something different: Haurchefant. Unlike Phase 1, you would need to manage the encounter and everything related to it while keeping Haurchefant alive. Should Haurchefant fall, the player still moved on to Phase 2, which was now actually Phase 5, but a wipe was inevitable as the fight became unwinnable, another first for a superboss, at least in this manner. If Haurchefant survived, however, then the second half of the raid series changed, becoming even more complicated and challenging than the first half, and this culminated in a confrontation against Dragon King Thordan. Compared to many of the recent Ultimate raids, and indeed the various phases of this one, Dragon King Thordan was mechanically quite similar and more akin to a traditional superboss from the wider franchise. But that didn't mean the challenge was diminished, and Thordan could deal some serious damage. In the months that followed Dragonsong's Reprise, players were challenged with another Savage Raid, but this was eclipsed by another Ultimate Raid that was released alongside patch 0.31 called the Omega Protocol. In the build-up, Yoshida had noted that Dragonsong's Reprise was the hardest Ultimate Raid found in the game, and that the Omega Protocol was not intended to be any harder. But upon release, players found a serious hike up in terms of challenge. Similar to Dragonsong's Reprise, the Omega Protocol served as a reimagining of a previous encounter, as the first 2 phases saw players square off again against Omega, then Omega M, and Omega F. Omega then attempted to reconfigure itself just like in the Alphascape Savage. But now, the encounter took a new path, as the Omega that emerged was different. From this point forward, the challenge ramped up even further, with some devilish phases, including one against Omega M, Omega F, Omega, and Omega Reconfigured, which culminated in a potential wipe should enough damage not be dealt. This then served as a precursor to the final phase against Alpha Omega. Due to all the potential variants at play throughout the entire raid, the Omega Protocol ended up being quite brutal for players, and it led to a lot of controversy. The first clear was only achieved through the use of third-party tools, and unlike the Epic of Alexander, this time there was significant backlash. It led to Yoshida even commenting. He confirmed that there was indeed an illicit use of third-party tools, and that the individuals identified would be punished. After the arrival of VIII in Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, fans were left curious as to who would appear as the superboss in the next installment of the trilogy, if indeed there would even be one within the base game. It turned out that Rebirth did indeed feature a superboss, but it manifested in a way that was quite different to many previous superbosses, except those that featured in Lightning Returns. Gilgamesh ended up being encountered numerous times throughout the game, as he was a prominent part of the Proto-Relic side quest. This then culminated with a trip to an isolated island in the Meridian Sea, where 4 challenging encounters needed to be overcome, and once accomplished, Gilgamesh could then be faced. The encounter itself had numerous quirks based around the stagger mechanic, and when reaching low health, Gilgamesh did a countdown move that could easily end in a swift game over. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect was that, similar to the superbosses in Lightning Returns, Gilgamesh could be fought on different difficulties, and this could have a dramatic impact on the challenge he posed. Final Fantasy XVI had the potential to be a very challenging game, but due to the way the gameplay mechanics were handled, there was nothing akin to a superboss within the base game. Svarog was perhaps the toughest challenge amongst the hunts, but the level was not raised any further after this point, and subsequent hunts did not raise expectations on the player. This notion remained much the same until the launch of Echoes of the Fallen, the game's first piece of downloadable content, and it wasn't until the Rising Tide that there was an encounter that ticked the superboss traits via the Shadow Within. Referencing back to some previous superbosses such as the Judge Magisters in Final Fantasy XII, the Shadow Within was hidden in a new endgame mode called the Kairos Gate, and it could only be fought against should the player complete every Kairos Gate stage on Final Fantasy difficulty with an S rating. This was no easy task. The Shadow Within then resurfaced another trait of a boss re-emerging as a much tougher superboss. In this case, the Shadow Within was an intense version of the Infernal Shadow. The unique angle here, however, was that due to the Kairos Gate being part of the Areta Stone, there was a leaderboard, and this meant players could see how they fared against other people who had attempted to beat the Shadow Within and succeeded. This leaderboard could also be used to highlight internal scores that were accomplished by using the Rings of Accessibility, an alternative to specific difficulty settings. That the superboss found deep within Final Fantasy XVI's downloadable content resurfaced these traits highlighted how far superbosses had come since their inclusion way back in the earliest Final Fantasy games. Whereas many of the original superbosses could be found wandering dungeons or indeed the world map, waiting to snare players in an unsuspecting and cruel trap, as the mechanics evolved, they became a purposeful way for the most hardcore players to test themselves. This often facilitated having quite high barriers for entry, and has led to superbosses being hidden away in bonus dungeons or bonus modes. But having now studied well over 100 different superbosses across the entire breadth of the franchise, from mainline entries through to spin-offs, mobile titles and MMOs, it's clear there are common threads that connect them all, even if they may not always be immediately obvious. But with that, my name is Daryl, and this has been the Complete Evolution of Superbosses. Thank you so much for watching, and if you had fun and enjoyed this rather lengthy discussion, please support the channel by liking the video and commenting below to give us your thoughts on the subject as a whole. Any interactions you make really do help us out, but they also help us to understand what you like to see. So if you do genuinely like this kind of content, please let us know. A special thanks also has to be given to our Patreon supporters. Without their support, this channel would not be possible. So every episode is dedicated to them, and especially Benjamin Snow, the livestream, Gregory, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent, and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion supporters. We are incredibly grateful to all of you, and to repeat, without your support, this channel would not be possible. If you would like to support the channel, consider becoming a member of Patreon. For as little as $3 per month, you gain access to perks such as videos early, free from advertising, audio-only versions of our super long-form content like this evolutionary series, and voting rights that help us determine what our next major evolutionary series is going to be. Alright everyone, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.